Section 16 of Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christopher Boone. Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks by William Le Queux. Chapter 15. More Criminals I Have Met. Dr. Crippen, the poisoner, gives me material for a murder mystery. My secret knowledge of him. On his arrest, I remain on the continent in order to avoid being called as witness. My friendship with Armstrong, the poisoner. Our chats in the club. At the invitation of the Paris police, I assist in the investigations against Landru, the French Bluebeard. What Landru said to me when he was brought to Cambay. My suspicions of an American multimillionaire. My adventures among criminals have been many. One little incident is kept ever fresh in my memory by the ring that is on my finger as I write these lines. I happened, as I periodically am, to be on a visit to the Balkans, seeking local color for a new novel, but principally picking up any scrap of information that might be of service to the confidential department at Whitehall that Lord Roberts had organized. I found myself in the picturesque little capital of Herzegovina, arriving at the Hotel Narenta late one evening. The town was well known to me, and the hotel, with its delightful gardens sloping to the river, is among the most comfortable in Eastern Europe. Ivan, the tall, bald-headed maître d'hôtel, welcomed me and gave me a very late dinner, after which I went along to the officers' casino and returned at about 12 o'clock. I suppose it was about 3 when I was awakened by a half-dressed waiter who, speaking in Serbian, which I understood slightly, told me that an elderly English gentleman who had arrived that morning had been taken very ill. The waiter could not understand English. Would I kindly see him? I got up and, following the man, was taken to a large bedroom, where in bed lay a white-bearded old man, apparently in great pain. With difficulty he asked me to summon a doctor, which I did at once. The stranger's face was death-like, and very soon after my entry he lost consciousness. Presently a young Serbian doctor arrived, and, the patient being conscious again, I translated his symptoms as well as I could. Then, after a further half-hour, the mixture that the doctor had hastily given him brought him round again completely, so much so that he sat up in bed and chatted quite cheerily. He told me that sometimes he had similar attacks. "Curiously enough, they generally come on when I'm traveling alone," he went on. "It is really very good of you to have taken so much trouble over a stranger. But now, please, you must return to bed, and not worry about me any more. I shall be quite all right. My name is Askew, Charles Askew. We will meet in the morning. What is your name?" I told him, but I sensed something peculiar, an air of mystery that I could not define. He seemed very anxious about a battered tin box that lay on a table near him. I had the impression that he suspected me of taking the key and opening it during the time he was unconscious. When I returned to my room, I began to wonder whether he was a crook in hiding, for Herzegovina is a good country in which to hide one's identity. Next day, we went for a long walk together, and the old fellow talked shrewdly of many matters, but concerning himself he was extremely reticent. I showed him the bazaar where one can buy beautiful oriental work much cheaper than in the bazaar at Sarajevo or at Constantinople. On the following day, we walked a long way up the beautiful valley of the Boone River. Whatever else Mr. Askew was, he was a studious man, a lover of nature, and something of a botanist, possessing a wide knowledge of wild birds and their habits. He had a keen, rugged face that made him look younger than his years. In his habits he was frugal. For his breakfast he took fruit, which he ate sparingly, and at both lunch and dinner limited himself to a single glass of white wine. He also smoked only 3 cigarettes a day. One day, as we were wandering about the town of the 30 Mosques, as the place is often called, he turned to me and, with a laugh, said, "You may think me a bit of a crank. Perhaps I am. I sometimes come abroad alone, just for a change, and forget to leave my address, and—" Then he suddenly hesitated, rather embarrassed, I thought, and did not finish his sentence. As we returned to lunch, I became more than ever convinced that Mr. Askew was a crook in hiding. That same night, however, when I went to my room before dinner, I found on my dressing table an envelope addressed to me. I tore it open and, to my surprise, found inside the curious antique ring that Mr. Askew had worn on his finger and in which, as it was unique, I had evinced an interest. With it was a charming little note of thanks, begging me to accept the ring as a souvenir. A letter signed by one of America's multi-millionaires, a man who is credited to be one of the richest men in all the world. I dashed downstairs, only to be told by the porter that Mr. Askew had left Mostar an hour before for Agram. The ring has ever since been on my finger, as a present from one of the most modest, charming, and unassuming of men I have ever been privileged to meet. And I had suspected him of being a crook in hiding. The keeper of the gems at the Louvre in Paris has pronounced the gem set in the ring to be one of the smallest engraved Greek gems in the world. It still has its ancient oval setting in ivory, yellow with age, while the perfectly engraved Greek figures can be seen only by the aid of a magnifying glass. How it was ever engraved in the days before the invention of the microscope is a mystery. Among the many letters I have received from readers of my books in various parts of the world, none perhaps has been more curious than the epistle that the hall porter at the Devonshire Club handed to me one night on my return from the continent. Many letters from unknown readers are of interest, some of them suggesting new themes and new plots for books. It was so in this case. The brief, polite letter was from a certain Dr. Adams, living in Essex, who expressed himself greatly interested in my mysteries of love and crime, and asking when it would be convenient for me to see him, as he had a suggestion to put before me regarding a new and exciting plot. I was particularly busy at the time, and was about to go to Khartoum, therefore I replied that I was leaving London for 3 months. After the lapse of that period, he wrote again, and was so anxious to see me, at any time or any place in London, that I made an appointment at the club, and one morning he called. He was a dapper, fair-haired man, of middle age, very well dressed, with a tall hat and patent leather boots. I took him into one of the smaller rooms, and while we smoked he told me that he was a doctor in the country and an ardent reader of my books, especially those that concerned secret poisoning. "In one of your books you mention a volume, Secrets of the State of Venice," he said. "I believe it gives, in Latin, copied from the original secret documents of the Council of Ten, still preserved in the archives of Venice, the formula used in preparing the slow poisons used by those in the pay of the council to poison their enemies." I explained that it was a very rare book, which had been printed in Petrograd about 1869, and that I had found it in a second-hand bookseller's shop in Stockholm. It was at the moment in my study in Florence. My visitor expressed regret that it was not in London, but hoped that he might one day be permitted to read it. He went on to tell me that he had been in the Far East and had made deep studies in toxicology. Indeed, he seemed to know the standard manual of Dr. Witthaus by heart. And then he quoted many bewildering facts concerning poisons. "I suppose many people are deliberately poisoned and the murderer never traced?" I remarked. "Hundreds," he declared. "Since the days when Palmer poisoned 13 people with his old-fashioned strychnine, in those days very hard to discover, hundreds of people of both sexes have been got rid of by poison or the bacteria of fatal diseases." I was inclined to be a little skeptical, and mentioned the skill of such pathologists as Doctors Wilcox and Spilsbury, both of whom I knew, and whose marvelous mirror tests for arsenic I had witnessed, whereupon, smiling, and in a strange, mysterious voice, he said, Ah, of course you do not know the newly invented poisons, some of them German. Poisons that, if administered in their proper doses, produce death from apparently perfectly natural causes and which utterly defy detection. This interested me, and I listened while he explained the effects of several of them, naming them and telling me the minimum fatal dose of each. He spoke of death calmly and coolly, as only medical men can. Poisoners are always bunglers, he declared. The fools use arsenic, antimony, alkaloidal, and glucosidal poisons under the delusion that they won't be found out. Sometimes they are not. The doctor who has been attending the patient for some disorder and the patient apparently dies from it is often unsuspicious. He gives a certificate of death without even dreaming that poison is the cause. Have you ever known such cases? I asked. He hesitated, then with some little evasion, I thought, declared that there had, no doubt, been many. Our conversation was certainly such as would interest anyone who, like myself, studied the psychology of crime. The next time we met was in Devonshire. He happened to be at the Plymouth and motored across Dartmoor one afternoon to call. Again, as we sat in my study, our conversation drifted to his pet subject, one by which he seemed obsessed, namely that of secret poisoning. He described to me the formula of certain secret poisons and, after a long chat, told me more about the newly discovered poisons, and of one which, if given hypodermically, would cause almost instant death, as though from heart failure. If the body were discovered at once, poison might be suspected because of a peculiar smell, which, however, would disappear after about 4 hours, he added. To obviate that, the puncture or scratch should be rubbed with menthol, and I defy any pathologist to discover the true cause of death. Then he confessed to me that the reason he had approached me was because my books had attracted him, and that he thought he might be able to suggest the plot of an up-to-date novel dealing with the most subtle form of poisoning. I listened as he unfolded to me a most diabolical and ingenious plot, at which I sat aghast at the man's mentality. He had weighed every detail and taken every precaution that there was no flaw by which the assassin could be traced. I agreed that it was wonderful, but far too morbid and horrible. Bah, he laughed. Tell the public the truth, and show them how easy it is to commit murder and go scot-free. It would protect them from jealous, murderously inclined enemies. We met several times afterwards, and he unfolded to me many plots from his fertile brain, one of which, indeed, I did use later in my novel, The Red Widow. But in his presence I always felt a strong antipathy toward him, though he was such a frank, merry, easygoing man. He had explained so many means by which deadly poisons and bacterial fatal diseases could be disseminated that at last, whenever I received a letter from him, I opened it with the scissors, held it from me as I read it, and dropped it straight into the fire. I confess that I feared lest he might do me harm. At last, I refused to see him any more, and a few weeks later I went back to Florence, where I had rented a villa on the Viale dei Colli, and forgot about the affable but repulsive Adams. One day, however, on opening the Daily Mirror, I saw a large photograph of him smiling out at me. He was wanted by the police, having eloped with a young girl named Leneve after the sudden disappearance of his wife in Hilldrop Crescent, Holloway. Beneath the photograph of my whilom friend Dr. George Adams was the name of Dr. Crippen. I confess that the unexpected charge against him caused me considerable anxiety. I knew that he was an expert poisoner and felt certain that his poor wife had died at his hand. He had on that first day we met declared to me that poisoners are always bunglers, and certainly he himself had been no exception. That his wife was not the only person he had murdered, I feel confident, because of the halting and evasive replies he gave to many of my questions. He was, no doubt, an expert who knew as much about the latest discovered poisons and their effects as any of our greatest toxicologists. He had declared to me, with what truth I know not, that a certain chemist in Frankfurt sold secret poisons with full directions at very high figures and asked no questions. This seems to be borne out, for in at least 2 recent cases of murder by poison, one in France and one in Italy, the poison used is known to have come from Frankfurt. At last, by means of wireless, Crippen was detected and arrested with the girl. Portions of his wife's body were discovered, and he was charged with poisoning her. Then I suddenly recollected. I had written him 2 or 3 letters. Would the police discover them and call me as witness? I knew that the evidence I could give would have great weight with the jury, but I had no desire to appear at the Old Bailey. Therefore, I remained in Florence and said nothing to anyone till, on Crippen being executed, I breathed more freely. Another queer but perfectly cool murderer was the world's great lover, Henri Désiré Landru, the French Bluebeard. He was a little bald-headed, spade-bearded man with deep-set ferret eyes. In April 1919, he was arrested at his home in the Rue Rochechouart in Paris because a woman to whom he had promised marriage had mysteriously disappeared. The sister of the missing woman had accidentally recognized him in the street and insisted that a police agent should watch where he went. Slowly, and with great patience, the Sûreté learned that their prisoner was a man of mystery known as Diard, Dupont, Fréminet, Guillet, and a dozen other names, and one of the most alert and cunning escrocs in France. Soon the police began to discover that on at least 8 occasions he had proposed marriage to women who, in each case, were never afterward seen, and of whose fortunes he had managed to acquire entire possession. It was plain that he had been gambling in women's lives, but if he had murdered them, where were the bodies? For over a year he was kept in prison and constantly interrogated, but not by a single word did he betray the truth. There was no evidence against him, and he constantly declared his innocence. The houses in which he had lived out in the country at Neuilly, Verneuil, and the villa of mystery at Gambé, in the forest of Rambouillet, had been investigated, but nothing had been found. Indeed, it looked as though he would have to be released, when, in 1921, the police decided on making a more thorough investigation at the villa at Gambé, which several of the missing women had been known to visit. As one interested in criminology, I was invited by the chief of the Sûreté to assist the police and the medicologists in their investigations. I motored out each day from Paris to a lonely house called the Hermitage, on the high road to Udon. There I rendered what assistance I could in the excavations, which consisted in digging up the rather extensive garden and a field adjoining, taking up the floors of the villa itself, as well as the concrete flooring of the outhouses and garage. It was under the concrete of the latter that we discovered a number of small pieces of charred bone, which, after microscopic examination in Landru's dining room, where an apparatus had been set up, the medical experts, Doctors Anthony and Paul, declared to have come from at least 3 bodies. In addition, we found burned hairpins, 2 steel stay busks, bone buttons, and other objects. The search had been exciting enough, and we were all keen on examining most critically each handful of earth and stone. But those were the discoveries that eventually brought Landru to the guillotine. The authorities resolved on a reconstruction of the crime, for now they were certain that several of the missing women that had been lured to the lonely house, killed, and their bodies cremated in the kitchen stove. I was present. Landru, brought by car under police guard and in secret, arrived at the scene of his crimes at about 11 o'clock one morning. When he was brought into the small dining room, where it was supposed he had poisoned his victims before disposing of their bodies, his demeanor showed nothing of the criminal. He wished us a polite "Bonjour, messieurs." Then, glancing around that room, which had no doubt been the scene of several most diabolical crimes, 6, it is believed, smiled superciliously. "Henri Désiré Landru, You are accused of willfully poisoning in this room Madame Aon on December 6, 1916, and of poisoning Madame Calonne on Christmas Day, 1916, said the examining magistrate in French in a deep, hard voice. Rubbish, laughed the prisoner with a nonchalant air. It is the accusation against you. Then prove it, said Landru jeeringly. You must prove your innocence, replied the magistrate. I am innocent, that is all, was his reply. And I thank you for a very pleasant motor ride. The air of Gambay is always delightful. I wish I were coming back here to spend a holiday, but I shall, messieurs, never fear. I whispered in English to the detective who had been working in the excavations for the past fortnight, and he overheard me. Ah, he sneered, I don't know who you are, but you seem very amused at all this. So am I. You can call me Bluebeard. Oh, how foolish and farcical it is. I made no reply, but addressing me again, he said, I suppose, monsieur, that you are one of the wonderful doctors who hope to establish the fact that when I brought ladies here, I killed them for their valuables. Well, all I reply is, just establish the facts. I thank you all for a glorious run through the forest. The examining magistrate put to him other severe questions, but never for a second could he upset the marvelous equanimity of the prisoner. The next time I saw Landru, on November 30th, 1921, was in the crowded and stifling Assize Court at Versailles. The place was packed. The court had risen. The jury were absent to consider the verdict, and before their box was an array of furniture and women's clothing that gave one the idea of a second-hand dealer's shop. The atmosphere was electrical. All the world waited to hear the verdict. Suddenly, Landru was brought in, his face pale, more yellow and strained than when he had jeered at us at Gambay. He noticed the smart women of Paris straining their necks to get sight of him. From his seat, a few seconds later, he rose and, bowing politely to the spectators, said with the same cynical smile that he had given me, I wonder if there be any lady in court who would like to take my place. I'm quite ready to vacate it, I assure you. Those were the last words to the public of one of the greatest and most callous criminals of our time. 5 minutes later, he was condemned to death. He was theatrical to the end, but his calmness never deserted him. His counsel, Maître Moura Giaferi, who is an old friend of mine and one of the most famous criminal lawyers in Europe, appealed, but the conviction was upheld, and at 4 o'clock on the morning of February 25th, 1922, Landru, on being offered the usual glass of rum and a cigarette, said with the same cynical laugh, I do not need them. I am brave. A few seconds later, the knife fell, and he was dead. How many women he had murdered will never be known. My next meeting with a murderer was one cold March afternoon. I was sitting before the big fire in the smoking room of a certain West End club of which I am a member. I omit its name for obvious reasons. When there strolled in a fellow member with whom I have often chatted when we were spending an idle hour of gossip over our tea and toast. He was a country solicitor living in Herefordshire, and he had been a member only a couple of years. Business frequently brought him to London, and on such occasions he slept at the club. He was a man of refinement and taste, a good talker, a golf enthusiast, and somewhat humorous. He was, indeed, quite popular. That March Sunday afternoon I remember well, as I was just back from ski-running in Murin. As he stood before the fire, I chanced to remark that the Crimes Club was holding their usual dinner that night, and I was remaining in town to attend it. In my profession, I am constantly dealing with petty crime. I would so much like to go to one of your dinners, he said. I suppose you discuss the celebrated cases of poisoning and so on? It must be most interesting. I replied that at the meetings many unknown facts concerning great crimes were often revealed. But as I sat there, I never dreamed of the terrible crime of which, not a month before, the man standing astride the rug had been guilty. He had deliberately poisoned his wife, and at that moment she was lying in her grave. Yes, he repeated, throwing himself into a big armchair and lazily smoking an excellent cigar. I should so much like to be present at one of the meetings. I met my fellow clubman on quite half a dozen subsequent occasions, and no doubt he would have found the deliberations of the Crimes Club full of interest, for he was none other than the notorious poisoner Herbert Rouse Armstrong. When his wife's body was exhumed by order of the Home Office about 7 months after our fireside conversation, arsenic was found to have been the cause of death, and then came another charge of attempting to poison a friend. As everyone knows, Armstrong was hanged in Gloucester Gaol in January 1922. Yes, I have met some very queer people. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16 of Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Julie Anne Thompson. Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks by William LeQueux. Spies and Spying, Part 1. I think I can claim to be the first person to warn Great Britain that the Kaiser was plotting a war against us. I discovered, as far back as 1905, a great network of German espionage spread over the United Kingdom. I found out the secret through a friend in Berlin, who was at the time under director of the Kaiser's spy bureau, and who had married an Englishwoman who was believed by all, except her husband, to be German. As is usual in Germany, his master did not exactly, quote, play the game, unquote, with him, and therefore in 1905 he told me frankly what was in progress. I came back from Germany and endeavored to awaken public opinion concerning the peril, but my voice was, alas, that of one crying in the wilderness. Spies! What on earth did Germany want to spy upon us for? Were we not good friends with Germany? Had not the Kaiser assured Lord Haldane of his peaceful intentions? Did not the great warlord in his golden helmet come to Buckingham Palace, and did he not parade the embankment on his way to the mansion house? No, LeQueux was a writer of romance. Who could believe a word he said? So nobody would listen to me. No newspaper would publish any article that I wrote, although I asked no payment for it. I sent 4 London daily newspapers a letter of warning, asking the editor to publish it. All returned it. The editor of one of the most powerful organs wrote, "My dear LeQueux, we cannot publish this. Spies exist only in your imagination. We don't want to alarm the public." Alarm the public? I, who knew the truth, was walking about London telling people a story at which they only laughed. Now to my friend Earl Roberts I related what I had discovered. He listened to me attentively and declared that he too was very suspicious of Germany's intentions. I introduced him to Lord Northcliffe, and we all 3 discussed the peril for over an hour. I next consulted Colonel Lockwood, MP for Epping, now Lord Lambourne. He heard me, instituted his own inquiries in Essex, and 3 weeks later entirely agreed with me. He realized the danger and one day put a question in the House, whereupon the whole of our legislators laughed him to scorn. Spies! It was LeQueux with a bee in his bonnet again. I saw Prince Louis of Battenberg and Lord Charles Beresford, who, on my producing facts that I had at my own expense obtained, fully agreed that a serious peril existed. In this way, the small circle of the men I have named first became aware of Germany's elaborate system of espionage that was working in every direction for one purpose only, a coming war. The Admiralty had a kind of scratch intelligence service at the time, and so had the War Office. If any officer happened to obtain a titbit of information, he sent it, quote, to the proper quarter, end quote, where it was pigeonholed and nobody ever again referred to it. Scotland Yard, with its much vaunted special branch, looked after wild Irishmen and political undesirables, but spies? Oh, it was all very absurd. The greatest empire of the world, sucking down daily the soothing syrup handed out by a pro-German press, declared Lord Roberts, Lord Northcliffe, and myself to be a set of scaremongers. I was in a quandary, but just at that moment, when nobody would publish a word concerning the spy peril, my old friend Mr. D.C. Thompson, proprietor of the Dundee Courier, and a group of influential newspapers in Scotland and England, heard what I had to say, and after consulting with one of his editors, Mr. G.B. Duncan, one of the most able and popular journalists in the kingdom, resolved to make some investigations. With Mr. Duncan, I traveled for some weeks about Scotland, gathering a quantity of information. On our return to Dundee, Mr. Thompson decided that, as the public refused to believe in the actual existence of German spies among us, or of the Kaiser's intentions for war, I should write a series of articles based on the facts that we had gathered. Thus I wrote the first story ever written about spies, called Spies of the Kaiser. It was published by Mr. Thompson in the Weekly News, a journal that has a huge circulation throughout the United Kingdom. It also appeared later in book form, and when the scales at last fell from the eyes of the public, I had many imitators who obtained much kudos and made much money out of the kind of article I had inaugurated. Still, the government was much against my having dared to tell the truth to the public. The octopus hand of Germany was on every walk of life, and I knew myself to be a marked man. My old friend in Berlin, who had long years before been a fellow student of mine in Paris, warned me one day when we met at the Hôtel des Indes at The Hague that if I proceeded with my exposures, I should certainly be ruined in some way or another. I laughed and expressed defiance. If I had not done so and had withdrawn from the attitude I had taken up, I might have today been a rich man. I came back to London, and in Lord Robert's study in Portland Place, I one morning told him what Her N had told me. "I feel that all is hopeless," I said to the gallant old field marshal. "I have done my level best, and nobody will hear me. I know the truth, but because I dare to tell it, people think I'm a lunatic. My popularity as a writer will wane, and I have to earn my living by my pen." "My dear Queux," said the white-mustached old soldier, holding out his hand in a fatherly manner, "the world thinks me a lunatic also, because, after my 40 years' service in India, I have come home and dared to tell England that she is unprepared for war. I know you fear that you will earn unpopularity if you persevere with your good work. But stand by me, follow me. Charles Beresford and I will support you in every way, and we will, between us, try and convince these careless, money-making people around us that they are living on the brink of a volcano." I grasped his outstretched hand, and thus the compact was made. Lord Roberts became commander-in-chief, and almost his first work was the formation, entirely apart from the official one, of a new voluntary Secret Service department, of which I became a member. Half a dozen patriotic men in secret banded themselves together, each paying his own expenses, set to work gathering information in Germany and elsewhere that might be useful to our country in case of need. Italy and the Near East were the regions allotted to me, but my travels took me also to Russia, to Germany, and to Austria. We soon discovered in our midst most remarkable ramifications of Germany's spy system. As time after time I came home to report to Lord Roberts what I had found out in the course of my travels as a wandering novelist, the great military leader became more than ever convinced of the Kaiser's slow but sure preparations for war. Suddenly I received a guarded note from my German friend Her N, asking whether I could meet him in Switzerland as he wished to renew my acquaintance. He would be in Zurich on a certain date. I read between the lines that he wished to see me, so I traveled to Zurich, where in my bedroom at the Dolder Hotel, he handed me a document that, when I brought it to London, caused the greatest sensation in certain quarters. It was the full report of a secret council held a month before at Potsdam, at which the Emperor presided, Prince Henry of Prussia, a clever man whom I knew personally, having been on one of his motor tours, the representatives of the leading federal states, and the chiefs of the Army and Navy, including my informant, being also present. At the secret council, the Kaiser appeared in naval uniform, pale, determined, and somewhat nervous and unstrung, my friend told me, and went on to describe the scene. The Emperor spoke for more than 2 hours, illustrating his speech with many maps and diagrams as well as models of new aircraft and long-range guns designed for the coming war. At first, the Emperor's voice had been almost inaudible, and he looked haggard and worn, but his words, according to the transcript that my friend gave me, and which I eventually produced in my book German Spies in England, after being forced by hostile public opinion to keep it secret for 7 years, were significant enough. He openly declared that he intended to have war. Quote, "In calling this council this evening, the Emperor said, 'I have followed the divine command. Almighty God has always been a great and true ally of the House of Hohenzollern, and it is to him that I, just as my august ancestors did, look for inspiration and guidance in the hour of need. After long hours of fervent prayer, light has at last come to me. You, my trusted counselors and my friends, before whom I have no secrets, can testify that it has been, ever since I ascended the throne, my most ardent desire to maintain the peace of the world and to cultivate, on a basis of mutual respect and esteem, friendship and goodwill with all the nations on the globe. I am aware that the course followed by me did not always meet with your approval, and that on many an occasion you would have been glad to see me use the mailed fist rather than the silken glove chosen by me in my dealings with certain foreign nations. It was a source of profound grief to me to see my best intentions misunderstood, but bulletproof against public censure and criticism, and responsible only to the Lord above us for my acts, I calmly continued to do what I considered to be my holy duty to the fatherland. True to the great traditions of Prussia and the House of Hohenzollern, I believed in the necessity of maintaining a great army and an adequate navy as the best guarantee of peace. In our zeal for the preservation of peace, we were compelled to keep pace with the ever-increasing armaments of our neighbors until the limit seems now to have been reached. We find ourselves now face to face with the most serious crisis in the history of our new German Empire. Owing to the heavy taxation and the enormous increase in the cost of living, the discontent of the masses is assuming alarming proportions and even infecting the middle and upper classes, which have, up to the present time, been the strongest pillar of the monarchy. But, worst of all, there are unmistakable signs that the discontent is spreading even among the troops, and that a secret, well-organized anti-military movement is afoot, calculated to destroy all discipline and to incite both my soldiers and sailors to open disobedience and rebellion. As, according to the reports of my Secret Service, a similar movement is making itself felt in nearly all the states of Europe, all indications point to the fact, which admits indeed no longer of any doubt, that we have to deal with an international revolutionary organization whose voiced object is the overthrowing of throne and altar and the establishment of a republican government. Breakers ahead is the call of the helmsman of the imperial ship of state, and I am ready to heed it. How to find an honorable and satisfactory solution of the problem is a question to which I have devoted the closest attention during these last months. The outlook is, I admit, dark, but we need not despair, for God, our great ally, has given into our hands the means of saving our empire from the dangers which are threatening it. You know what I mean. It is the wonderful invention which Count Zeppelin was able, through the grace of the Lord, to make for the safeguarding and glory of our beloved fatherland. In this invention, God has placed the means at my disposal to lead Germany triumphantly out of her present difficulties and to make once and for all good the words of our poet, Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Yes, gentlemen, Germany over everything in the world, the first power on earth, both in peace and war. That is my irrevocable decision. At present, we are, thanks to our airships and our new monster guns, which will be a surprise for our enemies, invincible, and can carry at will war into the enemy's own country. Of course, it is too early yet to fix the exact date when the blow shall be struck. But I will say this, that we shall strike as soon as I have a sufficiently large fleet of Zeppelins at my disposal. I have given orders for the hurried construction of more airships of the improved Zeppelin type, and when these are ready, we shall destroy England's North Sea, Channel, and Atlantic fleets, after which nothing on earth can prevent the landing of our army on British soil and its triumphant march to London. Do you remember, my generals, what our never-to-be-forgotten Field Marshal Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher exclaimed when looking from the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral upon the vast metropolis at his feet? It was short and to the point. What a splendid city to sack! You will desire to know how the outbreak of hostilities will be brought about. I can assure you on this point. Certainly we shall not have to go far to find a just cause for war. My army of spies scattered over Great Britain and France, as it is over North and South America, as well as all the other parts of the world where German interests may come to a clash with a foreign power, will take good care of that. I have issued already some time since secret orders that will, at the proper moment, accomplish what we desire." End of quote. In due course, I gave the document to Lord Roberts and also showed it to Lord Charles Beresford, Lord Northcliffe, Prince Louis of Battenberg, Rear Admiral H.W. Wilkin, and a number of officers of high rank. In addition, it was placed before the cabinet, who pooh-poohed it. Yet 6 years later, the Kaiser carried out his program almost to the very letter and came very near achieving his dastardly object. My friend from Berlin had given the report of that speech to me with these words: "There is a war coming, I am certain of it, and though I am a German, I am one who does not believe in war. Therefore, I think your friends should know what is intended and be warned in time. For that reason, I give it to you, assuring you that those words are the exact words used by His Majesty, and trusting to your honor always to regard your source of information as secret." I gave him my hand in pledge and have never divulged his name, even though during the war his ingenuity regarding the organization of enemy spies was very often pitted against my own. I have said that when I brought it to London, the speech created a great sensation among those to whom I showed it in confidence. Very naturally, its authenticity was doubted by some members of the cabinet, and all the machinery of the official Secret Service was set to work to try and discredit it. But certain facts were brought to light that left no doubt of its genuineness. I spoke to several publishers of my intention of writing a book, exposing the Kaiser's intentions for war, but they, one and all, dissuaded me, saying that such a subject would be unpopular. The country laughed at any idea of German treachery, and the book would in consequence be a complete failure. Now, the German government, by some means, learned that I was in possession of a report of that secret speech of the Kaiser's, and a curious incident resulted. In September 1909, I determined to write a book pointing out that Germany meant war. With that object, I showed Evelyn Nash, whose offices were then at Fawside House, Covent Garden, the opening chapters of my manuscript, together with the speech in question. He, in my presence, locked them in a drawer of the writing table in his private room. 2 days later, when Mr. Nash opened that drawer, he found that they had been stolen. German secret agents undoubtedly committed the theft, which was reported in certain newspapers at the time. For I have since learnt that my manuscript is now in the archives of the Secret Service in Berlin. This in itself is sufficient proof of how eager the Kaiser was to suppress his declaration of war. It was fortunate that I had kept a copy of the speech, which I did not publish till the outbreak of war. I was utterly disheartened at the apathy of the nation. I was doing my utmost, spending my hard-earned money in traveling and discovering the truth, yet nobody, except the few men I have already mentioned, would listen to me. I was openly told that my patriotism would spell ruin to me, as alas, it eventually did, thanks to the same pro-German influence then at work, officially deluding, reassuring, and lulling the public to sleep even as it is today. I was in despair, and one afternoon when I sat with Lord Roberts in his library, I told him that all I had endeavored to do was without avail, for I was being denounced on every hand as a scaremonger, and told that I was a novelist and should stick to my profession of writing fiction. If people prefer your fiction to your fact, why not write a work of fiction, a description of what would happen if a great war came and we were invaded, the field marshal suggested. The idea seemed a good one, but I pointed out that, not being a military man, I would make many technical blunders. Whereupon he said, "I have the country's welfare at heart, just as you have. I will prepare the scheme of attack and defense and give you hints if you will write the book." "And who will publish it?" I queried. "Try Lord Northcliffe," was his advice. I did. Next day I saw my old friend whom the Daily Mail staff called, quote, "the chief," end quote. Within an hour he had given me an open commission. I was to write, regardless of expense, a forecast of the invasion for the Daily Mail, besides being promised a very handsome price for it. "I know your pocket has suffered very much, Queux," he said, for he always called me by that name. "Write a good stirring forecast. Tell Lord Roberts we will both try and wake up the country to a sense of its peril." In high spirits, I went back to Portland Place and told the gallant old soldier, and that same evening we started to plan out an imaginary German invasion. Having carte blanche in the matter of expense, I sought the aid of Colonel Cyril Field, RMLI, and Major Matson, both military experts, while H.W. Wilson, the well-known naval expert, was eager and ready to assist me in connection with naval matters. For 4 months we reconnoitred the whole of East Anglia, from the Tyne to the Thames, making notes, marking maps, and finding out the most vulnerable points, including Weybourne Gap in Norfolk, which was no doubt one of the points marked by the Germans for their disembarkation at the proper moment. And then, on my return to London, I was appalled to find that I had spent over £3,000 on what some would have termed, quote, "a joyride," end quote. Lord Northcliffe paid it, remarking that, provided the forecast was well done, he would not mind the expense. Then I took a flat in Queen Anne's Mansions, Westminster, and there began to write. It was a colossal task, as may well be imagined by anyone who has read the book, and further I had to surmount a heavier barrier than any I had ever dreamed might obstruct my way. Thus, when at last I had, after a year's work, finished the manuscript, and Lord Roberts had read every line and corrected any mistake I had made, and one morning, as will perhaps be remembered, the whole front pages of the Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Morning Post, the Daily Mail, and the Daily Chronicle, as well as the front pages of certain great provincial papers, bore a map of England showing the districts that would be invaded and announcing that the publication of my forecast, The Invasion, would commence in the Daily Mail on the morrow. The Campbell-Bannerman government determined that every word I wrote should be discredited and held in derision. End of Chapter 16, Part 1. Chapter 16 of Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anne Thompson. Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks by William Le Queux. Spies and Spying, Part 2. That same afternoon in the House of Commons, a question was asked of the Prime Minister whether his attentions had been directed to the advertisements. The campaign against me had now started in real earnest. Sir H. Campbell Bannerman replied that he had seen the advertisements and, denouncing me as a mere scaremonger, declared that such work was pernicious literature, quote, calculated to inflame public opinion abroad and alarm the more ignorant public at home, end quote. I at once wrote asking how he could criticize a work he had never read, and moreover, why he accused his electors, the British public, of being more ignorant than their neighbors across the channel. I knew it was a poser, but of the jugglery of politics there is no end, so I smiled and forgave him when next day he sent by special messenger a note in his own handwriting marked "strictly private," and in which he apologized for the words he had used. He meant the more ignorant section of the public at home, and hoped that I would not, in the exigencies of politics, take any word of his as being personally offensive. He concluded by asking me to call at Downing Street when I could, as he wanted to make full explanation. Next day the Daily Mail appeared with the opening chapters of my work. It proved a huge success. Everyone congratulated me on it. At the Savage Club, at the Devonshire, at Boodle's, at the Reform, at the houses I visited, I was hailed as the man who dared to tell the truth. Naturally, I was much gratified, for among the letters I received was one that I here publish for the first time. Quote, 47 Portland Place, London, W., 22nd of August, 1906. Dear Mr. LeQueux, I return with many thanks the enclosure of your letter of 2nd of August. The imaginary scheme seems carefully thought out, and it forcibly illustrates the risk we should run under present military conditions if, owing to the temporary absence or inferiority of our fleet, a continental power, meaning Germany, were able to seize an opportunity for landing a large force of picked soldiers in this country. The maintenance at home of an adequate number of well-trained and organized troops and reservists would not only set free the Navy for offensive action and the protection of our seaborne commerce, by relieving it to an appreciable extent of the onerous obligation which it has lately undertaken of defending these shores without military cooperation, but would also enable such reinforcements to be dispatched to our colonies and dependencies as might be required to preserve the integrity and safeguard the interest of the British Empire. I therefore wish you every success in your endeavor to impress upon the people of this country that the possession of a worldwide empire carries with it defensive obligations commensurate with the commercial and other advantages which it confers, and that, without concerted and patriotic effort, we may not improbably lose what our ancestors won. Believe me, yours very truly, Roberts. End of quote. Have we not already lost Ireland, and are we not daily losing grip on Australia and on Canada? Is the reader aware that the newspapers in the latter country, when advertising for a man to do a job, add, "No English need apply"? I received a flood of other congratulatory letters from, among others, the Duke of Northumberland, the Duke of Argyll, the Duke of Fife, the Earl of Derby, the Earl of Rosebery, the Earl of Wemyss, Viscount Milner, Viscount Hardinge, Lord Brassey, Lord Tweedmouth, Lord Newton, Field Marshal Sir George White, Lieutenant General Sir William Nicholson, Sir Ralph Moore, Major General Sir J. Wolfe Murray, Sir Albert Rowlett, M.P., Sir William Holland, M.P., Sir Joseph Dimsdale, M.P., Sir Charles Lawson, Sir Francis Tressbury, M.P., Sir Henry Seton Carr, Sir Theodore V.S. Angier, Major General Sir Edwin Cullen, Sir John Turney, Sir Henry W. Tyler, Colonel Sir Reginald Hennell, General Sir Stanley Edwards, Sir Alfred Newton, Sir Fortescue Flannery, MP, Colonel Sir Henry Rawlinson, Alderman and Sheriff Sir Vesey Strong, Sheriff Sir George Woodman, and Mr. Spencer Wilkinson, all of whom became my personal friends and supporters. I found myself popular among those who knew of the pro-German propaganda and its financial influence. At last, England seemed about to wake up. Shortly afterwards, I attended with Earl Roberts a meeting to consider national defense, which was called by the London Chamber of Commerce and presided over by the Lord Mayor at the Mansion House. The Field Marshal had stated in the House of Lords that our armed forces were as absolutely unfitted and unprepared as they had been in 1899. Quote, "What the nation requires, especially that portion of it occupied with the great business interests of the country," he told the crowded meeting, "is peace and security not only from actual war, but from alarms and panics. Such security, I regret to say, and I think you will agree with me, cannot be ensured by diplomacy alone or by a policy of conciliation alone, as some would have us believe. The only true safeguard is that the armed forces of the Crown should be in such a state of readiness and efficiency that it would not be to the interest of any power to risk war with us." Thus, in a splendid, vigorous speech, he put before them facts showing our hopeless insecurity and strongly urged that the country should awaken to the peril of the apathy into which it had fallen. Afterwards, Lord Brassey, in proposing a vote of thanks, made a fine speech, and later, when Earl Roberts introduced me to him in the Lord Mayor's parlor, he congratulated me on the invasion. The Daily Mail had scored a success, even though the staff themselves had at first expressed some doubts as to its reception. Then, on Everleigh Nash publishing it in book form, with an introduction by Earl Roberts, it at once went through many editions. It caused such widespread attention because no critic could pick a hole in the invasion scheme, designed as it was by one of the greatest strategists of our time, that it was translated into no fewer than 27 languages, including Arabic, Urdu, Icelandic, Syrian, Japanese, and Chinese. Naturally, I was much gratified at having at last aroused the British nation and others to realize that the Kaiser's pretensions of friendship were false. My friends saw that we were drifting towards war, yet, though I had made a success with the invasion, its result was exactly the opposite to what I had hoped. The world read my book eagerly. They devoured the scenes of how our shores were invaded, of the fierce battles in Essex, Lancashire, and Yorkshire, and of the enemy's advance on London. Then, on finishing the book, they simply set it aside, and admitting that it was quite an exciting work of imagination, set me down as a second-class Jules Verne. But a greater disillusionment came when a plausible, round-faced German came over from Berlin, called on Mr. A.P. Watt, my literary agent, and arranged with him to pay a very handsome sum for the German rights of the book. I was in Naples when I received my agent's letter and by telegram accepted the terms of the Concordia Press in Berlin, congratulating myself that even our enemies would learn the truth that they could not invade us with success. Judge my chagrin when, 6 months later, I saw an illustrated edition of the invasion in German, the conclusion of which had been entirely rewritten, making the result of the invasion a German success. And there were pictures of Germans sacking London. Worse, it was published and bound in gilt as a prize for German boys at school. I walked into the chief's room at the Daily Mail offices filled with fury and disgust. Under English law, I'm an Englishman and I love England. I said to Lord Northcliffe, "But being the son of a French father, I'm also a Frenchman, and I thank God for it." Those were my first words when I entered his room, and they caused him to turn quickly from his chair where he was dictating letters to his secretary, Miss Owen. "Hello, Queux, you're not well. What's up?" he asked. "Max had just been in with a bad stomachache. He's got a chill through wearing a new fancy vest that hasn't been aired." He referred to Max Pemberton. I fear I used some rather strong language, but in his usual humorous way he calmed me and asked me down to Elmwood, his place near Broadstairs, for the weekend. I saw that we had advanced no farther in arousing the public. Had it not been for Earl Roberts, Lord Northcliffe, Mr. Lloyd George, Lord Charles Beresford, and a few other intimate friends, I should have given up. But when bent on achieving an object, I am perhaps rather tenacious. So the money I had received in royalties from the invasion, I again spent on traveling Europe as a secret agent of Great Britain. I parted with my money freely, leading a gay life with the one idea of gaining information of use to Great Britain. I was the only Englishman who ever entered the great gun factory of Ehrhart's in Dusseldorf, where they were then constructing big guns. If my identity had been discovered, I should have spent the remainder of my life in a German fortress. My escapade cost me a large sum in bribery, which I paid to a certain adventurer in Constantinople, but I got the knowledge that I wanted. In due course, the result of my adventure was reported by me, docketed, and sent to those dusty pigeonholes in the War Office. The staff there, all keen and eager, dare not, after Lord Roberts retired, show any alertness or enterprise. The government had said, "There are no spies," and the staff of the intelligence branch was compelled to assume a lack of intelligence. It is curious, as a writer in the Daily Mail pointed out recently, that in The Invasion, written 5 years before the Great War, not only was the Battle of Jutland forecasted, but several of the ships sunk were actually described as sunk, while, in addition, the bombardment of Scarborough was predicted, and some of the houses struck by shells actually named. Strange coincidences, at least. The whole situation in 1910 to 1913 was hopeless. All I could do was to write novels in which I took as my villain a spy. They became popular. One could write spies in fiction, but to say there were spies in real life was almost an offense against king and country. One September night in 1910, I had an adventure in London that opened my eyes widely to what was in progress, and to how our national existence was at stake, though the nation was so entirely ignorant. I received a note from General Sir Alfred Turner, who lived in Cheyne Walk and whom I had not met, declaring that he greatly admired my patriotism and asked me to dine en famille one Sunday evening. I accepted the invitation and went. To my great surprise, I found among the guests the German ambassador, the chancellor of the embassy, the military and naval attachés with their ladies, Lady Tree, Miss Viola Tree, Mr. Lewis Waller, Lady Westmoreland, Lady Dorothy Neville, and others. In a corner of the drawing room after dinner, I found myself chatting with the German military attaché, a man who was hail fellow well met with every journalist in London, who turned the conversation round to my anti-German writings. By his invitation, I met him at his club next day. He entertained me to an expensive luncheon, and then suddenly laughed at me for what he termed my misguided propaganda. "There will be no war between your country and mine," he assured me. "You are so very foolish, my dear Mr. Le Queux. You have ruined your reputation by these fixed ideas of yours. Why not change them? We desire no quarrel with Great Britain, but we also, of course, realize that you are doing only what you consider to be your duty." "It is my duty," I responded. My diplomatic friend sucked at his cigar and laughed. As a literary man, you, of course, write to interest the public, but you would interest your public just as easily by writing in favor of Germany. And I tell you that we should quickly recognize the favor you do us and recompense you well for it. I rose from my chair. I confess that I grew angry, and I told him what was in my mind. I gave him a message to his own Secret Service in Berlin, which was very terse and to the point, and then I left his club. I give this as one single instance of the cunning manner in which the German Secret Service endeavored to nobble and bribe me so as to close my mouth and thus combat my activity. Another instance was when the Norddeutscher Lloyd Line of Bremen kindly invited me to take a voyage round the world free of expense so that I might visit the various German colonies and write descriptions of them. And on a third occasion, German diplomats were amazingly kind to me, both in Constantinople and in Belgrade, and again broadly hinted at their readiness to win me over to their side. How pitiable, how absolutely criminal was our apathy. Here is another instance. One August morning in 1913, a year before the war, I was sauntering along the village street at Southborough-on-the-Hill, 3 miles south of Tunbridge in Kent. I was dressed as a city man, taking a country holiday, and had a camera hanging from a strap over my shoulder. I had a girl with me in order to complete the picture. I was down in that rural retreat in order to watch certain things that were in progress. What I saw and photographed was certainly of great interest. About 25 German officers in mufti, all speaking German and making no disguise of their nationality, rode through Southborough and during the whole day actually reconnoitered very carefully the hills between Tunbridge and Tunbridge Wells, taking many bearings, deliberating on sites for guns, and taking photographs. They were preparing for the invasion of England. That night, the party returned to London, where they were entertained by the German ambassador at Carlton House Terrace. Such a deliberate survey of our own country by a foreign army was outrageous. I showed my photographs to Lord Roberts, and he, much incensed, urged me to write to the press. I did so, but the British public had been doped, and not a single newspaper published a line concerning the enemy's survey of the Kentish hills. One editor wrote to me declaring me to be a fool. That was only a year before the outbreak of war. I often wonder by whose orders it was that all the motor signs on high roads from the Kentish coast to London were marked by the black and white stripes of German official direction posts. It would be interesting to discover, for they silently pointed the way from the coast to the capital, and the public little dreamed of why they were black and white. That the Germans intended to effect a sudden and unexpected landing on the east and south coasts was proved in many ways. Earl Roberts, Lord Northcliffe, and myself tried to point it out time after time, but our warnings always fell on deaf ears. It was given over to me to investigate. I found that on the east coast from Hull to Felixstowe, most hotels facing the sea had either a German manager or proprietor, or if not, there were Germans occupying private houses or boarding houses on the seafront of every town. Again, wherever a tenant was wanted for a public house, a German-born applicant was ready to accept almost any condition to take up the license, while in no fewer than 42 cases, as I reported to the War Office, Germans or pretended Frenchmen or Swiss were living either next door or next door but one to the most important telegraph offices, ready to make a dash and seize or destroy the instruments on the day. Happily, the day of the invasion never came, but it was not prevented by any effort on the part of the pro-German party, which in 1914 existed in Britain, just as it exists here today. By that staff ride of German cavalry in Kent, it was plain that the downfall of England was being plotted. But who cared so long as officialdom had its pickings and enjoyed its own social standing? I was only laughed at for the trouble I had taken to watch it. Do not the souls of the millions who died on the battlefields of France, of Belgium, of Italy, and of the East rise against the plotters? Does not the onus of the frightful loss of the flower of our dear English lads lie, not on our 400-a-year legislators, but on some of the golfing, dividend-seeking, pushful pro-Germans with old-world English names, often assumed, who have ruled our country through past years? What will be the opinion of those who come after us? Without politics, I repeat, for I am no politician and have never voted in my life, I would pay a tribute, the tribute that the whole nation should pay to Mr. Lloyd George and his advisers who came in for so much adverse criticism before the war. I declare as my opinion, an opinion that millions share, that the manner in which he, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, faced and grappled with the financial situation at the outbreak of war was an illusion of British pluck, coolness, and readiness unequaled in our history. As I have already stated, my only feeling is one of pure patriotism towards the country that gave me birth. Any of these plain statements of fact, which I here set down, I defy any political or official juggling to disprove. Though we are at peace today, there are signs everywhere of another war in the very near future. The writing on the wall is there for those who are intelligent enough to read it. Today, throughout the world, there is frantic and gigantic effort to produce fresh war material of a far more destructive nature. Fast bombing aeroplanes, poison gases, microbe bombs, and high explosives such as the world has never before seen. And against whom? Great Britain, without a shadow of a doubt. Though we once cleared the enemy out of our island, he is here again in full force. From the widespread and insidious secret service of Germany, nothing is sacred. Details of our new helicopter were known in Berlin 2 days after its secret trials, while of a new war vessel launched in secret this summer, photographs reached Berlin within a week. Germany laughs at our apathy and still boasts that she knows all about us, our political, military, and civil population alike. I know that from the inside. In the archives of Herr Steinauer's department in Berlin, there are thousands on thousands of detailed reports, furnished constantly throughout the past 10 years, regarding the lives and means of prominent persons in England, with descriptions of their homes wherein, one day, the undefeated enemy hoped to billet their troops. Then we have those unscrupulous people, men and women who act as, quote, fixed posts, and it is no exaggeration to say that there are still dozens back again in England, notwithstanding all official assurances to the contrary, who have all gone through an elaborate system of training and signaling, in reducing messages to code, and in decoding them, in map-making, in the use of carrier pigeons, and of secret wireless. Today, more than ever, the German nation hopes to strike in secret a staggering blow against London and our ports, not by invasion from the sea, but after paralyzing us from the air, to land an army. I fear that no political soothing syrup, by whatever party, has any effect whatever on me, because I happen to know what I am writing about. I have not forgotten that Mr. McKenna told us that all German spies in our country were, quote, safely under lock and key, end quote. Though a week later there were arrested a number of dangerous spies, 2 of whom were afterwards executed. Nor have I forgotten what trouble I got into for publicly mentioning this fact at a lecture I gave one afternoon at Buxton. After my speech, all the London press, both morning and evening, were served with notices forbidding them to publish my remarks. Charles Palmer of the Globe showed me the notice served on him and laughingly said, "Does not that in itself bear out your argument that certain authorities ruled by the hidden hand of Germany are afraid of your merciless exposures?" Well, I tried to be patriotic and have ever endeavored to do my best for my country, even though it was all unavailing. But I feel strongly that I should still continue to raise my voice in warning and declare that Germany still means to attack and, if possible, conquer Great Britain, and is actually at the moment stirring up strife for that purpose. End of Chapter 16, Part 2.
Section 19 of Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities, and Crooks by William Le Queux. About other spies and the truth concerning Jack the Ripper. Chapter 17. The British public are, even today, ignorant of the widespread and powerful pro-German influence that was at work in our country before the outbreak of war, during the struggle for our national existence, and continues even today. I am a thorn in the side of the traitors. There is no doubt whatever of the truth a certain cabinet minister told me when he said, "There are a good many people in England who are wishing that something would happen to you, Le Queux." "I know," I said, "and I know the reason." In high quarters, strings were being pulled constantly against me, much to my detriment. The penalty I paid for daring to write The Invasion proved of very serious consequences to me, inasmuch as the newspapers that did not agree with my patriotic endeavors tried to suppress me by refusing to publish any more of my novels serially. And by this, I lost a very considerable part of my income. Nevertheless, my friends encouraged me in the work I was striving to do, and I felt sufficiently rewarded to know that when the war came, my efforts were appreciated, even by many of those who had hitherto turned a deaf ear to all my warnings. And now let me explain why I was such a thorn in the side of our traitors who, working in unison, constituted the hidden hand. They feared me because I possessed knowledge of their identities, and in many cases of the sums secretly paid to them by Germany. The truth was that in 1912, my friend Herr N., for my personal information, showed me a list of persons in England to whom German money had been, and was still being, indirectly paid. And he was their paymaster. I was aghast at the sight of this list. I sat staggered. It was appalling that persons whom the nation considered highly patriotic and upright, and who were afterwards loudest in their praise of our gallant fellows, should have fallen into the insidious tentacles of the great German octopus. I know that this sensational statement will be questioned, but I vouch on my honor and all I hold most sacred as to its truth. Remember the traitors unearthed in France, Lenoir, Bolo Pasha, and many others, and what Germany was doing in France she did also in England, though here our betrayers have remained undiscovered and are allowed to go free in full possession of their blood money. The names I read in that list were mostly well known throughout the country, and embraced persons of the higher and official classes, members of Parliament and others, including 2 influential writers who were my friends. I asked to be allowed to make a copy of the list, but my request was refused. Therefore, I could only carry the names in my memory. In it, the Foreign Office, Home Office, India Office, Admiralty, and War Office were all represented, and all should have faced the firing party instead of living today, lolling in their cars and enjoying themselves on the price of their treachery. "Now you see for yourself how Germany is working," my friend said as he replaced that amazing document in his pocket. "You know the truth concerning your own betrayers. But, of course, you will regard what I have shown you as strictly confidential. One day, if we are conquered, we may publish those names. Who knows?" My lips have been sealed till today. There are traitors in every camp, and Britain was, and still is, no exception. Would that Germany would publish those names and the amounts annually paid to each. I hinted at what I knew to my friends, and for that reason I believe Lord Charles Beresford, one day, during the war, turned on a certain politician in his bluff, fiery way and declared him in my presence to be among the traitors, and the politician only laughed. During the war, many events proved beyond all doubt that we were being betrayed by some persons in authority. Therefore, the facts speak for themselves. I make no charge against any government as a whole. Each did its best in turn, but our betrayers were in our midst and secretly pulled the wires that worked the hidden hand. Many persons have wondered why I have met with much hostility in certain official circles, but what I here reveal for the first time is surely sufficient explanation. By some means it had become known to the traitors that I had gained knowledge of them, and, in fear lest I should make disclosures of how they had been bribed by German gold, they united to discredit me and to wreck my reputation. To what extent this was carried is shown by an incident that occurred 2 days after war was declared. Scotland Yard knew that ever since the publication of the invasion and my campaign against the Hun, I had received a number of threatening letters, all of which I sent to the department. The Metropolitan Police, feeling that I was in personal peril while the country was still swarming with Germans, very properly placed a police guard night and day on my house, for I was then living at Upper Halliford, near Sunbury-on-Thames, which is in the Metropolitan Police area. Indeed, the detective inspector who saw me expressed the view that I was in grave danger, and for that reason they had resolved to give me protection. So a constable lurked each night in the summer house in my garden. 2 days later, at orders from a higher quarter, my police protection was suddenly withdrawn. By the hidden hand, of course, the hand of someone who hoped every day that something might happen to me, for I was a person who knew too much. A few weeks later, I was lunching at Lady Owen Phillips's when my friend Mrs. Eckstein, who sat next to me, said, "Oh, Mr. Le Queux, do you know the latest about yourself? It is all over London that you are really a German spy. I've heard it from half a dozen people during the past week. I wonder who started such a wicked report." I only smiled. I knew that it had come from the traitors in order to hound me down and discredit me in case I broke my vow of silence concerning them. Further, I greatly incensed the authorities by my campaign that demanded that all Germans of whatever class should be interned. I was, however, assisted by Lord Leith of Fyvie, Sir W. Joynson Hicks, an old friend and a true Englishman, the Duke of Newcastle, another old friend, the Earl of Crawford, Earl Clarendon, Lord Galway, Lord Headley, and others. For months, the wire pullers resisted. Sir Edgar Speyer, Privy Councillor, put his fingers to his nose at the king and crossed to America. Yet not till after we held a violent meeting at the Mansion House, where many hard things were said, did the authorities at last, yet very reluctantly, resolve to intern enemy aliens. I happen to know that, so bitter was their opposition to our just demands, they actually interned 2 Germans who, being employed in our own secret service, were doing valuable work for us. Hundreds of dangerous aliens were allowed to slip through the meshes of the net by those who, bent on our downfall, were awaiting the landing of the Germans. Indeed, at no period of the war were they all interned. Further, though I pointed out to the authorities that Detective Sergeant Wegner, who was Russian-born and spoke German like a native, and had been conveniently retired from Scotland Yard at the outbreak of war, should be reemployed, it was refused, even though he had been an expert on alien enemies in the West End. I myself undertook some investigations on the Clyde, assisted by Alexander Morton, the messenger-at-arms of Glasgow, and in one case I found a German carrying on a typewriting school, actually training secretaries, some 30 of whom he had managed to get posts at the naval base at Rosyth. I published the results of my investigations in the Glasgow Sunday Post, and by doing so, further incensed the authorities, who were anxious to suppress me. After that, I wrote a book, German Spies in England, and, in open defiance of the idiotic censorship, published it. There were fierce official threats to prosecute me and also my publisher, Mr. Stanley Paul, but I presume it was feared that I might make some rather nasty accusations and bring proof against certain highly placed persons, so the matter was allowed to drop. Then I went further and wrote another fearless exposure of the truth, which I called Britain's Deadly Peril, and again defiantly published it, well knowing that I had a patriotic circle of good friends behind me. I awaited prosecution, but none came. About this time, a Danish bookseller, who sells my books in Copenhagen, wrote to me telling me he had just returned from Berlin, where he had heard of the naval raid on Scarborough 3 days before it took place. He was often in London before the war, and in the course of his interesting letter he wrote, "I always thought the spy mania in England exaggerated, but now I am absolutely persuaded that even those Englishmen who recognize this peril do not realize the lengths to which it goes. They have been suspecting waiters and servants, whilst the spies are in high social positions. They have contented themselves with searching the houses of German barbers and grocers, whilst neglecting the hands which collect and forward to Berlin the information gathered by more humble satellites. It is very sad to have to say such things, but I think the most dangerous spies still in England are not Germans, whether naturalized or not, but are people belonging to neutral countries, even to countries actually fighting Germany, and also subjects of Great Britain herself. I would not have written this if I was not sure of it. The diplomat from whom I got the information assured me that there are some English and French of both sexes who come regularly to Berlin or to frontier towns through neutral countries and have conversations with officials and then return. The restrictions as to luggage and passports, both in France and in England, are not half so severe as they should be. They are even slacker than at the beginning of the war. I know personally of a number of stolen American passports under the shelter of which German spies are now traveling, and an Italian consul with whom I happened to travel a few days ago said he had discovered 2 fellows with false Italian passports almost perfectly imitated. In Berlin, I heard people, well-informed people, saying that in every English town of importance, and on every spot of strategical value on the British coast, Germany has got a few friends keeping their eyes open and ready to receive an eventual German raid, and to give their friends as strong a hand as possible. That letter bore out exactly what I was trying to preach every day. One day, while lunching with Lord Northcliffe at his house in St. James Place, I having assisted Lady Northcliffe and the Duchess of Roxburgh in the organization of a field hospital for Serbia, he said to me, "Queux, my dear fellow, why don't you lecture? Tell the people about spies and their ways. Having been our spy yourself, you know the game better than anybody. I'm sure it would interest people." As first I demurred, but he pressed me, assuring me that it would cause the people to think. There are spies everywhere among us, as you are aware. The authorities are most reluctant to arrest one, for reasons we already know. Now and then one is caught, just in order to make pretense of our great vigilance and keep incompetent people in their jobs. So I decided to lecture. Perhaps some of those who read this book may have listened to me while I spoke from one or other of the 228 different platforms I occupied in as many different towns, from Aberdeen to Brighton and from Cromer to Carmarthen. Lord Headley, who is a great humorist, often took the chair, and among other chairmen I had the Earl of Middleton, ex-Minister for War, the Earl of Clarendon, the Marquis of Linlithgow, Lord Rochdale, Lord Leith of Fyvie, and many peers, parsons, provincial mayors, and distinguished people. Now, Lord Headley is a ventriloquist inasmuch as he can speak without moving his lips. He lives at St. Margaret's, near Twickenham, and I introduced him to Douglas Sladen, who lived across the Thames at Richmond, so the pair became great friends. But it was his lordship's ventriloquial abilities that worried me. We would travel down from London together by car to some distant town, arrive about 6 o'clock, eat a chop, and go to the place where I was billed to lecture, usually for some local charity, so I paid the expenses. Duly we arrived on the platform amid applause, and duly he would rise and make an eulogistic speech that caused me to blush. Then, when I rose and began to try and entertain my audience for an hour and a half without the aid of pictures, no easy task in these days, if one is not a variety performer, I assure you, he would presently, sotto voce, give his humorous impressions of the audience. I heard whispered loudly, though nobody else could hear, something as follows. "Good Lord, what a funny crowd! Putrid! Look at that old girl at the corner of the third row. What a guy! She'll look under the bed tonight to make sure there's not a spy there." Then a pause. "That's it! They've all got their mouths open now. Tell them a funny story. Yes, they're right with you every time. Look at the reporters scribbling it all down. Lots in the papers tomorrow. Phew, the place is packed. I'm tired, beastly tired." I was compelled to endure this, and much more, for he would single out persons in the audience, indicate them, and criticize their personal appearance in such a manner that I had to clench my hands and set my jaws hard to keep myself from laughing in the faces of my listeners. One hot summer's night, I was advertised to lecture in the town hall at Windsor, and we drove down together by car from London. It was for charity. I was suffering from a bad cold in the head, and I could hardly speak. Indeed, I had been in bed till 4 o'clock, but was determined not to disappoint those who wished to hear me. I had been told, too, that, the court being in residence at the castle, a number of officials attached to it had taken tickets. On the way down, I said to my chairman, "Look here, Headley, no humor tonight. I'm horribly ill and really can't stand it. How I shall get through it, I don't know." "My dear fellow, I can see you're queer," he replied. "I won't utter a single word. Dry up early, and let's get back as soon as we can. We have to go up to Newcastle tomorrow, remember." And so it was arranged. The big hall was packed. His lordship explained that I was suffering from a very bad cold, and had risen from my bed to fulfill my promise in the cause of charity. Then I rose, and I started in a voice that I fear was very harsh and hoarse. Though feeling only half awake, I nevertheless did my best. For nearly half an hour I went on, till suddenly I heard that familiar voice exclaim in a whisper, "I know that you will forgive me. I humbly apologize, but I really can't help it. Don't kick me when you get me outside, will you? But we've actually come across it at last. Great Scott, look!" I continued lecturing, determined to take no notice of his lordship's remark. A few minutes later he said, "Ah, it's quite evident that you've lost your sight as well as your voice. No, you're not looking in the right direction. You're blind." I continued with my lecture, telling a story that made the audience laugh. "My dear fellow," whispered my chairman, "do look down below, in the first row of the stalls." I did so, and at once I burst out laughing with the audience. I could not help it. In a seat right beneath where I stood sat an elderly lady in black, with a double-sized old-fashioned ear trumpet, covered with a little black lace curtain. and as she listened intently, she turned the whites of her eyes upwards to me. She was the wife of a famous headmaster, whose name I think I may as well omit. When we got outside, Lord Headley said, "I knew, my dear LeQueux, that you would, in such circumstances, forgive me for breaking my promise. But I couldn't resist. Oh, what a time we have on these lectures, don't we?" I had many other humorous adventures on my lecture tour. More than once I found Horatio Bottomley lecturing in the same town as myself and staying at the same hotel. On such occasions we always had supper together. I knew him in London quite well, for I used to write for John Bull. Almost the first week I went out lecturing, I met him on the railway platform at Perth on a winter's day, both of us going up to Dundee. "Well, LeQueux," he asked, bustling up with his secretary behind him, "what are you doing here?" I told him that I was out lecturing. "So am I, dear boy," he said in his breezy way. "So am I. Just trying to turn an honest penny, you know." At his trial he alleged that he made nothing by his tub-thumping lectures that drew such big crowds because he was such a fine showman. But I happened to know that he would turn up his nose at a fee of 100 guineas to lecture. He told me so. At that moment Horatio was the idol of the middle and lower classes. They believed in him, and certainly he was very outspoken in his criticisms, and, like myself, was hated by the authorities because he dared to tell the truth. One afternoon I strolled in at one of his lectures in a mining town, where, quite unexpectedly, he pointed to me and told his audience what I had done for England. I was cheered to the echo, and felt most embarrassed. I could write a volume about my amusing experiences while lecturing. Traveling in wartime was bad enough, and what with food rationing, lack of motor cars, and such like inconveniences, it was really a dog's life. Both Mr. Lloyd George and Lord Colwyn were extremely good to me during my lecturing, for they both took a great interest in my propaganda against the enemy. Both knew that my attitude was correct and reliable beyond attack, for, had it not been, I should have been prosecuted and probably imprisoned for publishing books in defiance of the government's censorship. Here I will say a word concerning the censorship of letters. The reader will recollect that a huge department was formed to open and read everyone's correspondence. Hundreds of men, women, and flappers were engaged in Kingsway and its vicinity in order to throw dust in the eyes of the public, in pretense of preventing enemy communication. And one's letters were marked with the words, "Opened by the censor." This was all too funny for words, though you, my reader, and myself had to pay for it, even to the flappers' teapots. The whole department was a delusion and a fraud. I know this is a sweeping statement to make, but I make it because the German Secret Service had discovered a means of secret writing between the lines of an ordinary letter that, even if suspected and treated with chemical reagents, as so many hundreds were, the invisible writing, instead of being revealed, was instantly destroyed. I feel half inclined to explain the matter, but I hesitate to do so for fear that it may not be in the public interest. I know Herr Steinhauer, who acted as chief director of German espionage throughout the world. In 1913, while on one of my periodical visits to Turkey, I was staying as usual at the Pera Palace Hotel in Constantinople. Before dinner, Fred Stevens, who was one of the known crooks in Constantinople, now dead, lounged in, and we took our glass of sherry in the bar. As we lifted our glasses, there entered a tall, round-faced, smart-looking man of about 40, with a well-trimmed fair mustache and typically German, whom he introduced to me as Dr. Bointner. I understood that he was a representative of the big furnishing house of Hewart Wolf in Berlin, and that he was their buyer of Turkish, Persian, and Angora carpets, of which he was an expert. I strolled about with him for several days, and Stevens accompanied us. On 2 evenings we went together to the Concordia, the gay music hall in the Grand Rue, and one afternoon we crossed the Bosphorus to Scutari and spent a delightful evening there. It was not till 2 months later that, to my great surprise, I discovered that my entertaining friend, Dr. Bointner, was none other than the notorious Herr Steinhauer, the Kaiser's bosom friend and confidant, and head of the service of German espionage in Great Britain. About 18 months before the war, I met another highly interesting person whose name was afterwards on everyone's lips. It was in a far-off log-built fishing town, a black, treeless settlement, which for 3 months in the year endures the Arctic night. It was snowing hard when I stepped off the black old tramp steamer, laden with dried fish and whale oil, onto the new landing stage of what was afterwards to be an important strategic point, the little place founded in 1900 called Alexandrovsk. At that time, public works had just been ordered from Petrograd, the Catherine Harbor to be deepened, and a new quay built. I lunched with the captain of the ship, the engineer in charge of the works, the stout military commander in a gray uniform too small for him, and a scraggy-bearded, long-haired, ill-conditioned-looking man in a greasy black robe. His eyes were bloodshot and deep-set. He spoke the Russian of the mujik, but he wore, suspended by a heavy silver chain, a crucifix of magnificent emeralds. I wondered what could be the worth of those splendid gems. After we parted and I returned again to the ship, I inquired of Captain Thurstrup as to whom the priest might be. "Oh," he replied, "I ought to have told you. He is the monk Rasputin, the great friend of the emperor. There are all sorts of wonderful tales afloat as to his influence over the imperial family, and many of them are, I believe, true. He has come down to see the place and report to the emperor." Little did I dream that the dirty, unkempt, pasty-faced priest with his sinister smile and damp, flabby hand was the Kaiser's creature, who would eventually throw Holy Russia into the melting pot. I think it is well known that after the murder of the mock monk in Petrograd, the Kerensky government handed to me, in confidence, a great quantity of documents, which had been found in the safe in the cellar of his house, in order that I might write an account of the scoundrel's amazing career. This I did from the documentary evidence under the title of Rasputin, which met with great interest all over the world. Now among that huge mass of letters, telegrams, and compromising correspondence from the Empress and others, for Rasputin was a blackmailer as well as a priest, I found the greater part of a manuscript which he himself, a criminal, had evidently intended to publish, entitled Great Russian Criminals. It was in French, a language which the monk knew only slightly, and, being typed, had evidently been dictated. In it, I found to my amazement the actual truth concerning the Jack the Ripper crimes. I did not publish it in my book because I have been unable, until recently, to verify any of the facts alleged. I will, however, quote from Rasputin's own manuscript, which, before I returned it to the revolutionary government, I copied as follows. London was horrified by the evil work of a mysterious criminal known as Jack the Ripper, who killed and mutilated a number of women of ill repute in the East End of the capital. The repetition of the appalling crimes mystified the world. The true author of these atrocities was disclosed by a Russian well known in London, named Niederost, a spy of our secret police, who was a member of the Jubilee Street Club, the anarchist center in the east of London. One night in the club, the identity of Jack the Ripper was revealed to him by an old Russian anarchist, Nicholas Zveriev. The mysterious assassin was Dr. Alexander Petitchenko, who had been on the staff of the maternity hospital at Tver and lived on the second floor in the Maloneia, but had gone to London, where he lived with his sister in Westmoreland Road, Walworth. From there he sallied forth at night, took an omnibus across London Bridge, and walked to Whitechapel, where he committed his secret crimes. Alexander Petitchenko, according to Zveriev, whose record appears in the reports of the secret police, was aided by a friend of his named Levitsky and a young tailoress called Winberg. The latter would approach the victim and hold her in conversation, and Levitsky kept watch for the police patrols while the crimes and mutilations took place. Levitsky, who had been born in London, wrote the warning postcard signed Jack the Ripper to the police and press. It was through Levitsky that Zveriev knew the truth. The report of Nidarost's discovery amused our secret police greatly, for, as a matter of fact, they knew the whole details at the time, and had themselves actively aided and encouraged the crimes in order to exhibit to the world certain defects of the English police system. There having been some misunderstanding and rivalry between our own police and the British. It was indeed for that reason that Petitchenko, the greatest and boldest of all Russian criminal lunatics, was encouraged to go to London and commit that series of atrocious crimes in which agents of our police aided him. Eventually, at the orders of the Ministry of the Interior, the secret police smuggled the assassin out of London, and as Count Luiskovo, he landed at Ostend and was conducted by a Secret Service agent to Moscow. While there, he was, a few months later, caught red-handed attempting to murder and mutilate a woman named Vogak, and was eventually sent to an asylum, where he died in 1908. After the return to Russia of Levitsky and the woman Winberg, the secret police deemed it wise to suppress them, and they were therefore exiled to Yakutsk. Such are the actual facts of the Jack the Ripper mystery, which still puzzles the whole world. I venture to give this quotation from Rasputin's unfinished work because I have only recently discovered that a doctor named Petitchenko did actually live in Tver, and his homicidal tendencies were well known. Again, I have further found out that a man named Nidarost was a member of the Jubilee Street Club and was known in connection with the anarchist affray at Tottenham, and also with the Sydney Street affair. In addition, it must be remembered that during the war, Rasputin was plotting with Protopopov, Minister of the Interior, for the downfall of Russia, and therefore he had access to all the secret archives of that department, from which it is plain he obtained his facts. Hence, without agreeing that our police system is defective, I print these disclosures among Things I Know. End of section 19. Read by Marissa D. 6, Clearwater, Florida, April 6th, 2025.
Chapter 18. Stories of Famous Folk. Mr. Lloyd George, chafed by Lord Birkenhead, we journey together to eat oysters. Sir John Foster Fraser, Max Pemberton, and myself make a bet. How the ex-Premier pulled our leg. Sir Robert Horne and the New England mutton. General Brabzon and his good looks. Evelyn Nash's funny stories. Coulson Kernahan recounts some amusing episodes. Miss May Edgington and the film producer. How a novelist rode in a race. Sir Ryder Haggard and myself have an adventure. Last October, I went as fellow guest with Mr. Lloyd George, Lord Birkenhead and Sir Lamming Worthington Evans down to the annual Oyster Fest at Colchester. The Mayor of Colchester asked me to propose the toast of the Colne oyster fisheries. Why, I know not, but as Mr. Lloyd George was available at the last moment, I happily escaped the necessity of telling a lie as excuse. We were a merry party on the way down, for it included T.P. O'Connor, the Lord Mayor of London, and Lady Mayoress, Sir John Foster Fraser, Max Pemberton, and Mr. Lloyd George, who made us laugh with his many humorous remarks. He was wearing a particularly shabby felt hat, and Lord Birkenhead, always smartly groomed, chipped him about it. Mr. Lloyd George took off his faded hat, regarded it critically and said, "Do you think anybody will notice it? It's moving day today, for we are clearing out of Downing Street. The fact is, I couldn't find another." Sir John Foster Fraser, Max Pemberton and myself then made a bet that somebody at the coming Feast of Oysters would, in the course of his speech, certainly refer to the succulent bivalve. Later, we all three listened intently to the speeches, after we had eaten dozens of delicious oysters washed down with Chablis. Suddenly Mr. Lloyd George, beaming with good humour, rose and in the course of his speech said, And now that we have just partaken of these succulent, and then he paused and looked across to where Max and I were seated and smiled slyly. These very succulent oysters, he went on. I heard a distinct groan from Foster Fraser nearby. At that function, the Mayor of Colchester had, for some reason, issued the invitation to Sir William de Queux, and as such I appeared in all the newspapers, much to the amusement of my friends and also to that of the ex-Prime Minister. I have met so many famous folk and heard so many stories told that I hardly know where to commence. A dear friend of mine, who often kindly invited me to her delightful house, Inchmerry, is Constant Lady Delaware, who is the most charming hostess of the old school. She is extremely well versed in literature and knows innumerable literary people. Her son, the late Earl, was a great friend of mine in the days when he was developing Bexhill, and when all the financiers who helped him took their pound of flesh, much to the dear but rather erratic Earl's detriment. One winter evening his lordship met me at a railway station on the border of the New Forest, and drove me to his mother's house so furiously in the dark that I never thought I should live to enter the well-lighted stone hall. But I did, and there I found Evelyn Nash waiting for me, for he has been many friends a great friend to the Delawares. That night at dinner, I remember he told us an amusing story. He said, I once knew a wonderful old lady, Mrs. Herbert of Lanover, the mother of Lord Treowen. She was nearly 90 when she died, but at the end her brain was clear and her memory amazing. And when I used to stay with her at Llanover, she told me many good stories, of which the following is a sample. She married, in the early reign of Queen Victoria, Mr. John Arthur Jones of Clanarth Court, Monmouth. But she had not long been Mrs. Jones before she hated the name and asked her husband whether she could arrange to take the surname of Herbert, which he was quite entitled to do, as his family had intermarried with the Herberts. Being a very punctilious gentleman, Mr. Jones decided, before taking any definite steps in the matter, that he would write to Lord Pembroke, the head of the Herbert family, and ask whether he had any objection to his taking the name of Herbert. To the inquiry, Pembroke replied, I have not the slightest objection to your assuming the name of Herbert, providing in turn you don't ask me to take the name of Jones. I can recall 2 more amusing stories Nash told me before the smoking room fire at the Devonshire Club, with Lewis Edmonds, K.C., the chairman of the committee, standing astride on the hearthrug, and Noel Mobbs, Lord Blythe, and Lord Cowdray listening. He said General Sir John Brabson, who died recently, was a well-known figure in town. Among his friends he was called Brab, but he never could sound the letter R. He was more familiarly referred to as Wab. He was once talking to a lady in the drawing-room of a house where he had been invited for dinner, when a large, ugly-looking man with a large blue patch on his cheek and nose came into the room. Brab, who hadn't caught the lady's name, turned to her and said in a horrified accent, What a dreadful-looking fellow! Excuse me, General Brabazon, replied the lady frigidly, but that is my husband. Oh, really? Said Brab, who was not in the least perturbed by his blunder. How very interesting that I should have met you this evening, because very likely you can tell me. Is he like that all over? We all laughed, whereupon Nash went on. Dr. W.A. Chappell, who was Liberal MP for Stirlingshire for several years, told me an amusing story about Sir Robert Horne, the ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer. Sir Robert was the Conservative candidate who opposed him, and having heard that Dr. Chappell was a native of New Zealand, he determined to make the best of the information. One evening Sir Robert was addressing a meeting in the parish of Slamanan, where he was born, and remarked, I see around me many old friends with whom I have played on the green as a boy, and I venture to think that you would rather have the homebred stock than the New Zealand mutton. This was received with cheers and much laughter, but unfortunately its effect was spoilt by an old Scotsman, who shouted from the back of the hall, We can do fine with the mutton. It's the horns we dinna want. Sir Robert Horne was not returned at that election. Barrel Tozier, whose newly published volume, Recollections of a Rolling Stone, has been so much talked about, I have known for many years, And among amusing stories that he's not included in his book is one that he told me in Boodles recently. For some months during the war, he was billeted in a little cosmopolitan hotel in Rouen. And on going up to his bedroom, rather late one night, he found that his heavy earthenware hand basin had not been emptied. Deciding on a course habitual to the aborigines of the town, he opened his bedroom window, meaning to empty the basin outside of it, when to his horror the basin slipped from his hands and fell with a crash onto a glass roof on the ground below, and on the table where a lot of Canadian NCOs were playing jackpot. The howls of excitation and the outbursts of a frightful language that followed I shall never forget as long as I live. Tozer said to me. To avoid discovery, he at once switched off the light and jumped into bed. And the next day he had the satisfaction of hearing the Canadian NCOs declaring to each other the awful things that they would do to the owner of that basin if only they could lay their hands on him. But they never did lay their hands on him. The eccentric Dr. Khan, who, as Tozier tells us in his book, used to walk about the London streets in his shirt sleeves in the height of the season, had a great iron safe full of sixpences that he had collected. He thought it was insanitary to wear a tie, and therefore never wore one. He thought himself abstemious. He carried in his pocket a flask of port and a flask of sherry, from which he would give drinks to anybody he met in Oxford Street, or any neighbourhood that took his fancy. He was, at one time, the leading physician in Dawlish. He died a year or two ago, but Tozer does not like to tell us when Dr. Khan owned steeplechase horses. He, Tozer, used to train and ride them for him. One of the animals was, I well remember, a big raking chestnut called Kaiser, which Tozer rode at Torquay races, Totnes races, and elsewhere. It was at a Torquay meeting that happened to be standing by when a horse fell at a bank, throwing and stunning the rider. Tozer jumped on the animal's back and finished the race, coming in second. And the most curious thing was that when he went to weigh in, he exactly tipped the scale at the weight of the rider who had been thrown, so that had he won the race, it would have been awarded to the animal's owner. A racing friend tells me that the rule is, if a horse falls, anybody who is a qualified rider, as Basil Tozer was, is at liberty to get up and finish the race, if the horse be in the field when he fell, namely, that he had not jumped another fence. Stanley Austin, of the Daily Mirror, who is so well known in literary and bohemian circles, related a story to me lately. While we were dining together at the Arts Club, Sir William Orpen, KBERA, the famous portrait painter, was, he told me, staying at a well-known country house and incidentally painting the portrait of the wealthy owner. One morning, Sir William came down before breakfast to work on the portrait and was met in the hall by the butler, who said, "You're a painter, aren't you?" "Certainly," said Orpen. "Well, I wish you'd do a little job for me. That infernal fool, my young footman, has kicked some paint off the drawing-room floor, and there will be a devil of a row if the master sees it. Will you touch it up a bit?" "Of course I will," said Orpington, and fetched his palette and did the job, thoroughly enjoying the humour of the situation, as did the master when Orpen told him some time afterwards. The other day, when I was walking with a well-known member of the Wellington Club up St. James's Street, an elegantly dressed, foreign-looking man in a tall hat, morning coat and monocle suddenly passed us. They nodded, and I asked who he was. "Oh, don't you know? That's Count Glaxo," was my friend's reply. "They call him that because the father of so many bonny babies." Miss May Edgington, the well-known novelist and dramatist, who is one of the prettiest and most charming of all our lady writers, one afternoon with her husband motored out to see me at Guildford. Her husband is Mr. F.E. Bailey, editor of The Royal magazine. We were sitting together on the lawn discussing the sharp practice of the kinema trade and how the importation of German-made films was proving detrimental to our own products, when she told me a good story concerning our foreign kinema idea of English sport. "One of my stories has been recently filmed," she said, "and I was asked to the trade show to be guest of honour at the lunch afterwards. Although I hate films, I went to the trade show and saw that they had kept faithfully to the story, except that they had put in an extra scene at the beginning, depicting a lovely country house with its lawns, gardens and flowers, with beautiful women walking around in beautiful frocks, One or two of the women were leading petted greyhounds. The men were mostly in silk hats and morning coats, apparently proposing marriage to anybody they met under the rose arches. It was altogether a pretty scene. So when the film people asked me afterwards what I thought of my picture, I said it seemed very nice and that they had kept pretty close to the story except for the addition of the garden party with which it opened. Whereupon the producer replied somewhat coldly, "That isn't a garden party, Miss Edgington. That's a British coursing match." Coulson Kennanan, a friend of Swinburne and Watts Dunton, has been my friend ever since the days of long ago when he was a reader to Ward and Lock, the publishers, and recommended them to publish some of my earlier works. To him, quite recently, a well-known novelist with no small idea of himself, but who had in the Daily Chronicle a bad review of his latest book, said, "I don't care what the Chronicle says or what any infernal paper says about my work. I have a public behind me." "Have you?" remarked C.K. as he is known to his friends, with a smile. "That accounts, of course, for the odour of bad whisky that pervades you, and gives us some idea that you have very often had a head." "I might have said swelled head," remarked Kehanan, as he told me the story, but instead he went on. "You're lucky, my dear old fellow, to have a public behind you. My nearest pub at Fairlight is half a mile away." Mr. J. A. Craig, editor of Great Thoughts, remarked one day to Kehanan that a friend of his, the Rev. Principal Griffin Jones, was busy writing a book on Providence, a subject he had studied for 30 years. "Oh, that's nothing," said Kehanan. "I have studied and practised improvidence for more than 60. One day in the Savage Club, I asked Kehanan what he thought of a certain man. "Oh, well," he replied, "he's the sort of man whose chief interest in life would, I could well believe, be in his collection of postage stamps." A few months ago, I was lunching with him and Mrs. Coulson Kennanan, whose novels are so well known, at their pretty country house in Fairlight, near Hastings, where the windows command a magnificent view of the Sussex Downs and the sea. Among their guests was a very popular clergyman, the Rev. Halbert Boyd, author of that clever book, Men and Marvels, with whom we are both on terms of intimate friendship. While chaffing Boyd across the table, Kennanan remarked, "There are 4 creatures generally without conscience: cats, spiders, journalists, and clergymen." I added publishers to that list, and it was unanimously accepted. Another story told of him is that while lecturing at Norwich, one night a dog in the audience started barking furiously so that he could hardly be heard. When the dog had been unceremoniously hustled out, Kennanan, having stopped, said, "Now, if I was speaking in Parliament instead of lecturing here in Norwich, the papers tomorrow morning would punctuate its report with, in brackets, 'Interrupted by the member for barking.'" During a railway journey from London one night, he told me a story about a man who lived in the same East Coast town where he was once living. The man, whose name was Dixon, began life as a small barber, then turned into money lender and advanced onto mortgages, which he foreclosed as soon as he found his clients were pressed for money. He then started to develop a building estate and built a number of small detached villas in what he called Dixon's Avenue. Kennanan happened to be walking with a local friend when the name was being affixed to the end of the new road. "Ah, quite so," he remarked to his friend, who had sadly suffered at Dixon's hands. "Dixon's been having you all his life." Whilst writing this book, I had an amusing experience with my friend and neighbour, Sir Ryder Haggard. He had been asked to take the chair at the Gaiety Theatre at Hastings in aid of a fund for the starving children in Eastern Europe. Lady Paget, the organiser, spoke at some length, and after she had concluded, a speaker rose from the row of the novelist's supporters on the platform and began to address the meeting volubly on behalf of the League of Nations Union. Now, the League of Nations Union is like a red rag to a bull to the famous author of She. He had not noticed that the meeting was held under the auspices of the Union, so he writhed in his chair for some moments and then rose to protest against this gentleman addressing the meeting. The speaker apologised and was about to sit down when somebody shouted, "Go on, go on!" Another speaker explained humbly that the meeting had been called by the League of Nations Union, at which Sir Ryder's countenance was a study. He withdrew his protest and sat it out to the end, but as he and I went back to St. Leonard's, his anger knew no bounds, and he declared that he would never again take the chair at a charity meeting. Sir Rider Haggard's business acumen is well shown in the following. A certain well-known book of his, written years ago, was not copyrighted in the United States, and an enterprising film firm at Los Angeles, on discovering this, resolved to make a screenplay of it. They did so, and it was a huge success. It was brought to England and shown everywhere up and down the country, the company making huge profits, whilst its author waited patiently. Then, when it was all over, Sir Rider Haggard descended heavily on the offending pirates and compelled them to disgorge all the profits they had made in England and other countries where the story had been copyrighted. As I write these lines, I note with the deepest regret the death of my old bulldog friend Klondike Boyle, a big, blue-eyed man with a hard, bitter look. He was a son of a Canadian prairie, and a man whose adventures in the back of beyond would fill volumes. His baptismal name was Colonel Joseph Wentworth Boyle, DSO. At one time he was manager to Slavin, the pugilist, but on the outbreak of war he was on the Yukon, 10,000 miles from England, where he raised a machine gun corps, which was later trained at Whitley Camp in Surrey. He was known to everybody as the King of the Klondike, and while at Whitley was invited by my popular friend Mrs. George Pinchard to stay at Coombe Court, George Pinchard's beautiful place close by, and I dined with them one night. Whilst there, Mr. Pinchard's charming little daughter Coral became greatly attached to the big bluff fellow, and he gave her several small nuggets of Klondike gold. One day Coral came up to him and said, "You're a king, aren't you?" Boyle smiled at the child and replied, "They call me a king, but I'm not really one." "Ah," replied the little child, "I thought not, because you don't wear a crown." One day I was his fellow guest at Coombe, and with his hostess, Mrs. Pinchard, we were walking across the park to see the remounts, when the conversation turned on his great fortune. He described how during the gold rush he and his 7 companions did their thrilling 400-mile forced march from Dawson City to the Yukon. The party reached the Yukon more dead than alive. There were rumours that gold was to be found in that area, and with Frank Slavin as his partner, Boyle staked out a claim, the boundaries of which were determined only by the limit of view. "Yes," said Boyle, "as we crossed the beautiful park, we picked out a bend of the river as far as the eye could reach, and soon proved our claim and struck it square. The fact was that after the claim had proved to be the greatest placer alluvial gold mine in the world, Boyle and his associates took out £3 million worth of gold. Harry the Wint and his friend Tony Safe were up there at the time, and though they were both lucky, Boyle took the honours. Immediately after the armistice, I again met Boyle at the house of a well-known actress, and our conversation chanced to turn to the Near East. He became interested, especially about things I told him concerning Romania. It apparently fired his ambition to go there, for a few weeks later he went to Bucharest, and within a couple of months he had become a hero of the Romanians, a daredevil to his fingertips. He was absolutely without fear. It was he who, when the Bolshevists refused to hand over 60 Romanian prisoners, flew into the Bolshevist camp by French aeroplane, leaped into the same boat as his prisoners, and made the Russians take him with the prisoners to the Crimea. There he persuaded the Bolshevists to keep their word and returned with the prisoners to Bucharest. The King and Queen of Romania took a great fancy to him, so much so that our Foreign Office regarded him with considerable annoyance, for he became one of the leading men in that country. It was he who prevented one of the Romanian princes from eloping. Subsequently, he became food controller and also reorganized the Romanian railway service. He always appealed to me as one of the most daring adventurers I have ever met. He had the spirit of a lion and the heart of a child. Boyle latterly went everywhere with the King and Queen of Romania, and the last time I saw him was last summer, when he was bathing in the sea at Deauville, accompanied by the Queen, with the King of Spain watching. I afterwards had a chat with him in the Palm Court of the Normandy, when he told me that he had fallen foul of the British government, who suspected him of espionage. I have just mentioned Mrs. George Pinchard. She is one of the most witty and popular women in London, and has an enormous circle of friends, whom at a charming house in Chesterfield she so constantly entertains. When a certain man who had began life as a small grocer, had married his cook, and had waxed wealthy during the war, was made a baronet, Ruby Pinchard is credited with inventing a conundrum which went the rounds of society. What has the king accomplished that the Almighty was unable to do, was the question. The answer is, he's made Mrs. X a lady. George Pinchard, her husband, who was equally popular in society, is Lord of the Manor of Whitley, and was for some years master of the Chiddingfold hounds. One day during the war, George, on being told that a lady with a foreign name had changed it to Nelson, at once remarked, "Why Nelson? Why isn't she up to date and call herself Jellicoe at once?" The late Viscount Middleton was extremely nearsighted, indeed almost blind. One day he and George Pinchard were travelling together from Waterloo to Guildford, when, after chatting for a few moments, they both settled themselves and began to read. Suddenly Lord Middleton thought he had a bundle of rugs at his side, got up and began to lift them up onto the rack. There was a loud shriek, for the bundle proved to be a diminutive old lady wrapped in furs. Lord Middleton was most profuse in his apologies, and George Pinchard had to begin a merry conversation in order to clear the atmosphere. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities and Crooks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Beeswaxcandle. Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities and Crooks by William Le Queux. Chapter 19. Adventures in Clubland. I have known a good many clubs, and more clubmen of various social standing. My earliest club was a little congregation that used to meet every night, my student days, in Paris, at a table in the Café Vachette, in the Boule Miche. Paul Deschanel, my fellow student, who afterwards became President of the Republic, Spiridion, the great painter whose Sappho is so well known, and Révillon, whose Préfet of Basselbe, were members, with a dozen others. We called ourselves the Beggars' Club, and dined frugally every night, the meal usually ending in some rag or other. We drank nothing more intoxicating than a framboise, an orgeat, or a café cognac, known as a jus de chapeau, when funds permitted. We were beggars because we begged francs from one another. Often on my visiting Paris nowadays, I eat a meal alone in that same well-remembered corner, where I used to sit when a fellow student of so many who have since made their mark. Some are dead, while others occupy high positions in literature, art, politics, and medicine. My thoughts wander back to the Bohemia in Paris that has long ago been a thing of the past. The world where a man is judged neither by his pocket nor his coat, but only by his real worth as a sterling good fellow. It is perhaps not more than 7 years ago, when one summer's evening, while passing along the Boulevard de Clichy, I came across a tall, cadaverous old friend of my youth, Georges Brandenburg, the famous journalist of the Figaro. He was dressed in his old-fashioned flat-brimmed silk hat, much worn, a frock coat green with age, very baggy trousers, and a flowing black cravat. "Ah, mon cher Le Queux," he cried, patting me on the back. "Welcome to Paris again. Let's have a drink." I was compelled to have a glass of absinthe with him, and then, while we were gossiping about the Beggars' Club of the old days, he suddenly said, "But you must dine with me tonight. Oh, you must, my dear fellow. I will accept no excuse. I have to do my Figaro article afterwards, but we must dine first. Yes, you must dine with me." So we went forth again into the boulevard, when my dear old Bohemian friend stopped at a butcher's, bought half a kilo of beefsteak, which we roasted together over the gas stove in his carpetless high-up room. And it tasted sweeter to me, Bohemian that I am, than the very best dinner at the Ritz. And 2 months later he died of septic pneumonia, and with him passed the last of the old-fashioned Paris Bohemians, familiar to readers of Du Maurier's Troby. His biographical notice was excellently written by my friend Ernest Daudet. After the Beggars in Paris, the next club of which I became a member after coming to London as a journalist was the Junior Garrick, the premises of which were on the eastern corner of Adelphi Terrace. In the centre was the Savage, which still exists, and on the western corner the Crichton. I was a member of all 3 of them. In those days of comparative poverty, before I joined the Globe, I went mostly to the junior garrick, because if I had no money with which to pay for my dinner, as was often the case, the accommodating hall porter would lend me a small sum on my cheap watch and chain. How many times that watch and chain went backwards and forwards I could not count, but I could always rely on a good square club meal at the junior garrick. We were a merry bohemian crowd of literary men and actors, including Augustus Moore, Henry Mackay, who wrote Love Letters of a Violinist, Linton, the landscape painter, Beerbohm Tree, George R. Sims, old George Grossmith, who had just finished newspaper reporting at Bow Street, George Lay, the theatrical solicitor, Sir George Lewis, Penley, Charlie Glennie, William Terrace, the actor, Dan Leno, then earning about £5 a week and very glad to get a shop, Brandon Thomas, who wrote Charlie's Aunt, Henry Pettit, young Harry Irving, and a host of kindred spirits. Most of us were, in those days, a very fourth-rate lot in all our professions, just as was our club. Its furniture was extremely shabby, and its only claim to distinction was that it was established in an old Adams house, and had on its walls many oil paintings of considerable value. When the bailiffs were put in, those pictures were carefully considered, and when at last we were sold up, the hall porter's book, which everybody had to sign, sold for a big price because of the autographs of the members and their distinguished friends. I recall a little incident one Saturday night at the junior garrick. Penley, who was playing in the private secretary, Charles Glennie, who was resting, and myself had dined together at the club, and had gone with Penley to the theatre. The house was crowded, so we spent the evening in Spaulding's dressing room, and after Penley had rubbed off his grease paint and changed out of his clerical attire, he suggested that we should have supper at Rule's in Maiden Lane, which we did. Over the meal, Glennie suggested we should both spend Sunday at his house out at Isleworth, an invitation that we accepted. So into the Strand we sauntered, long after midnight, and Glennie, hailing a passing hansom cab, said, "Look here, cabby, how much do you want to take us 3 to Isleworth?" "Well, sir, I don't know where the devil it is, but I'll take you for a quid." The bargain was fixed. We 3 wedged ourselves into the cab and drove westward, trotting along Piccadilly, Knightsbridge, and Kensington, where I think I must have fallen asleep. At any rate, when I again opened my eyes, I found that we were at a standstill in the country, with the sun shining, and the old horse quietly grazing on the grass beside the road. I nudged Penley, who woke with a start, and in his thin, squeaky voice exclaimed, "Good Lord, where are we?" "I don't know, old man," was my reply. "There's a breath of country air, anyhow." He pushed up the trapdoor in the roof and shouted in his clerical voice, "Hey, cabby, where are we?" "I don't know, sir," replied a sleepy voice from above, "but we'll go and see." And he whipped up the old horse to explore, when at last we found ourselves well on the Portsmouth road near Esher, very far from Glennie's house. We had breakfast at the Bear, and it was high noon before we arrived at Isleworth. The Crichton Club was but a weak imitation of the junior garrick, and did not last very long. Most of its members were also the habitués of the junior garrick, and on its collapse some of us went to the Yorick in Bedford Street, Covent Garden, founded by Uncle Smith, once the leading light of the junior garrick. Others got themselves elected by hook or by crook to the Savage. Neither the premises of the Savage nor its members need any description by me. 30 years ago, the Prince of Wales, afterwards King Edward, used often to preside at our weekly house dinners, and the guests included the greatest men of the day. I can recall those dinners when we had Stanley, Nansen, who wrote his name on the green wall where one can see it still, half a dozen Lord Mayors and as many cabinet ministers, foreign diplomats, and statesmen galore as our guests, while there contributed to our postprandial entertainment such well-known men as Rutland Barrington, George Grossmith, Quartus Pounds, Toft the sculptor, Phil May, Alfred Prager, and dozens of others who were world famous. I've heard Alfred Prager, the president of the Society of Miniaturists, tell an amusing story of his introduction to the Savage Club. Phil May was my sponsor of this club, and on the day of my election he perpetrated a bit of spoof, the effect of which I have hardly lived on yet, after a membership of over 25 years. On introducing me as a new member in the bar, I noticed he made some sotto voce remark that I, naturally flattered, thought were only complimentary things about me, and that he wished to spare my blushes. I afterwards learnt that he told the fellows that I was immensely wealthy, and was equal to anything they could order in the way of drinks, and could simply buy the club up if I wanted to. Some took advantage of this, but others declined on the ground that they would never be able to return the compliment to a Croesus like myself. Alas, I had many an occasion afterwards on which I was compelled to make him explain away his little joke, and only gradually was I able to take my proper place as a humble exponent of one of the great impecunious professions. After being a member of the Savage some 10 years, Max Pemberton resigned, and so did I. Why, I really can't tell to this day. Perhaps it was because I had been invited to join the committee of the Lyric Club, the handsome and luxurious premises of which had just been built at the corner of Whitcomb Street and Coventry Street, just off Leicester Square. It was a society club of which Lord Lonsdale was the chief founder. It possessed all sorts of innovations, including a big private theatre, where theatrical shows could be given on Sunday evenings, and private dining rooms fitted as yacht cabins, Indian bungalows, etc., where the food was in keeping with the desired effect. Dinner in the yacht cabin was served by stewards in uniform, and in the Indian bungalow by Indian servants, and so forth. It was the first club of its kind to have lady guests, and its chief feature was its Sunday night theatrical entertainments. The club appealed to me as a bohemian. Indeed, I was a member of the Lyric Club all through the innumerable vicissitudes it withstood for many years. At last it died, and was resuscitated as the Prince of Wales's Club, under which title it dwindled away and was closed for a long time. It later became the Motor Club. Each time I pass its portico today, the sad tragedies recalled to me, and which I will now relate. Living in the Rue de Petit Champ in Paris was a friend of mine, Henri Jurgen, the well-known impresario. One afternoon, meeting me in the American bar of the Hotel Chatham, over which the ever-humorous Johnny so long presided, he invited me to dine with him at his flat. "I found 2 new girls the other day singing and dancing at a little café in Marseille. They are coming to dine with me tonight, and I am giving them a trial turn at Olympia afterwards," he said. "Come and dine too." I accepted, and found 2 very handsome, dark-eyed, and very modest young French girls, Provençal from their accent, neatly but poorly dressed, wearing cotton blouses and dark skirts. It was a merry meal, during which Jurgens urged them not to be frightened at appearing before a Paris audience. "They are no more critical than they are in Marseille," he assured them. The elder was a dancer, and the other, a few months her junior, a café singer. While we sat in the box in the theatre, they went on one after the other, among the early turns, and both were voted successes. The dancer executed a Spanish dance with castanets, showing wonderful agility, while the other sang 2 gay chansonettes with a splendid voice, and looked very charming in her stage dress. The dancer was afterwards known as La Belle Autereau, and the singer was her friend Liane de Ruys. In the later years of their huge successes, when they both became the rage of Paris and of London, and earned huge salaries, they often reflected on that night at Monsieur Jurgen's flat. About a year after their first appearance in Paris, Mademoiselle de Ruys, who was notable for her great beauty, came to London to sing at the Alhambra, and, knowing her well, I invited her to sing at the Lyric Club one Sunday night. She came and delighted the audience, which consisted mostly of well-known society people. Afterwards she had supper with me, and then, as we sat together in the corner of the room, she told me in confidence that Monsieur Jurgens had proposed marriage to her. "I have refused 3 times," she said. "He is such a dear, and has been so very good to me. Yet I really cannot marry a man I do not love. This morning I had a telegram from him. He will be here tomorrow morning, so I shall leave London as early as I can in the morning, as I do not want to meet him." "Where will you go?" "I really don't know. I have written to the Alhambra management, terminating my engagement." That was all she would tell me, but she seemed greatly perturbed. Presently, while she was standing in the hall with her cloak on and I was getting into my coat, a cab stopped, and my friend Jurgen, who was a member of the club, dashed in. The girl gave vent to an exclamation of amazement, and he excitedly persuaded her to go outside with him and get into the cab. For nearly half an hour the cab remained there, while the pair held an animated conversation. Then they drove off. That was the last I ever saw of my poor friend Jurgens. Next day he telegraphed me farewell from Dover, and that same night he committed suicide in his flat in Paris. That is why I can never pass the corner of Whitcomb Street and Coventry Street without a painful memory. Some 17 years ago I followed my old friend George R. Sims to the Devonshire Club, and there became one of a little literary circle that embraced Sir W. Robertson Nicol, Clement Shorter, Max Pemberton, Sir George Sutton, Arnold White, and Frank Richardson, of Whiskers fame, and G. H. Fosdyke Nichols, who is Queux of the Evening News, and knows more about people and their doings than any other man in London. Years have gone, but we all survive, as I write this, save poor Sims, Robertson Nicol, and the erratic Frank Richardson. I've been a member of a good many dining clubs, first the Old Vagabonds, then the New Vagabonds, and afterwards the Argonauts, all three having as their leading lights that dual control of my old friends Douglas Sladen and G.B. Bergen, the one hirsute and the other bald, but who, when working together to run a dining club, formed the most perfect combination in the world. All three clubs have been many times described, therefore I need not remark much about them, except that at the meetings of the New Vagabonds at the Hotel Cecil, one met everyone worth knowing, and everyone who had done something. Alas, it is 1,000 pities that the New Vagabonds no longer exists. I recollect when I asked Lord Roberts to become its president, he looked at me very gravely and asked, "What name did you say?" "The New Vagabonds," I replied, and I recited the roll of membership, which included many famous names associated with art, literature, and the drama. "Well," he said, "its title sounds uninviting, but I suppose I have been as much of a roving vagabond as most of you. Yes, if they want me to become its president, I will." Mr. G.B. Bergen, in his excellent book Memoirs of a Clubman, tells a story concerning myself at the first dinner of the New Vagabonds, over which Lord Roberts presided. He relates how, while I sat next to the president and wearing miniatures of my decorations, a girl, indicating myself, asked him, "Who is that distinguished general with the wistful face next to Lord Roberts?" Mr. Bergen also recalls an incident connected with the pronunciation of my somewhat unusual name. Not a nom de plume, as so many have believed. He says, "I was coming up to town one day when a girl and her mother got onto the train. The girl carried a book under her arm. When they were comfortably settled, the mother said, 'Give me that book of Le Queux, dear,' and the daughter replied, 'Excuse me, mother, but I think you mean Le Crooks.' They appealed to me, and I said authoritatively that the proper pronunciation was Le Queux. Another man in the corner broke in with Le Kicks, and they were still kicking it over when I left the train." Mr. Bergen was, of course, correct. My name, however, has always been a stumbling block, and more especially so since Pinero wrote The Gay Lord Queux. I am one of the earliest members of another club, which is known as Our Society. It was started by Arthur Lambden, to whom I believe I acted as literary godfather. Ingleby Oddie, now coroner for Westminster, H.B. Irving, Lord Robert Godolphin Osborne, and Herbert Cross, its object being the study of criminology. Professor Churton Collins, Sir Melvin Macnaghten of Scotland Yard, George R. Sims, Everly Nash, Sir A. Conan Doyle, Max Pemberton, Filson Young, Arthur D'Ossi, J. B. Harris Burland, P. W. Everett, Thomas Marlowe, editor of the Daily Mail, with Sir Sidney Russell Wells, Sir George Turner, and Sir H. Waterhouse as representatives of the medical profession, soon gathered round our board, and by the rules membership was strictly limited to 40. Lord Northcliffe, when he joined us, nicknamed us the 40 Thieves. About 3 or 4 dinners are held annually, and at them the latest mystery of crime is earnestly discussed, though there is a rule that our deliberations are entirely secret, and no word of them ever divulged. We have somehow now earned the sobriquet of the Crimes Club. About a dozen guests are allowed, and nowadays our membership has been increased to 60. Among the regular attendants, in addition to those mentioned above, are the Duke of Newcastle, Lord Portarlington, Lord Sackville, Lord Kintore, Sir Eric Drummond, Admiral Sir E. Inglefield, General Sir A. Balfour, Sir Wilfrid Atley, Sir Godfrey Baring, Sir John Hall, Sir Henry Jerningham, and Colonel G. Cornwallis West, while legal celebrities such as Sir E. Marshall Hall, K.C., Sir H. Curtis Bennett, K.C., and Sir Theobald Matthew are all to be seen around the table. Arthur Lambton, to whose untiring efforts the club is due, and who acts as honorary secretary, takes the chair, and the procedure is that a member reads a paper on some recent criminal case, and sometimes it is followed by a discussion in which counsel, who has acted for the prosecution or for the defence, takes part. The cases are analysed, and the mentality of the guilty one dissected in a manner that is of intense interest to those who study the psychology of crime. My own small contributions have been the description of the crimes of Landru, and how I helped the Sûreté to investigate them, and also a small description of spies I have met. It is certainly the most exclusive and most interesting club in London, and its subscription is 2 half-crowns yearly. There is, of course, a long waiting list, but no vacancy occurs unless a member resigns or dies. An additional loss to that of Lord Northcliffe, one of our best known and most popular members who has recently died, is caused by the death of my old and valued friend Arthur D'Ossi, traveller and lecturer, whose striking features, with the long upturned moustachios, were so well known in London drawing-rooms. He was my friend through 30 years, and in many ways a most remarkable figure in Bohemian London. Though born in London, he was the son of Martin D'Ossi, a Hungarian refugee and patriot. After being educated in Germany, he learned Japanese, became an advocate for an Anglo-Japanese alliance, founding the Japan Society and being its chairman. He knew Japan better than any other Englishman, and, let me whisper it, lectured for years on that country before he had ever visited it. I recollect, though we were close friends, we had not seen each other for about 6 years when I happened to arrive in Biskra, on the desert border in Algeria. The hotel was a third-rate one, the others all being full. Passing along the corridor, I heard a voice. D'Ossi's was peculiar, and once heard, was always remembered. So I knew who was my fellow guest. "What ho! Arthur!" I cried.
"What is that?"
asked D'Ossi with a strange rolling tongue. Then he turned the corner and facing me said,
"By the beard of the prophets, behold the mystery monger."
I met Arthur D'Ossi constantly all over Europe. When we sat together at the Crimes Club, we used to exchange jokes about our travels. Lord Northcliffe, who was one of his great admirers, said one night at the club when we were all there together,
"Look, Queux, look at the wily old Jap. Take good stock of him, for he's wonderful. He can lecture on any mortal subject on earth at 5 minutes' notice."
And so he could. Poor Arthur D'Ossi. He was a man after my own heart, and I hesitate to let my pen run further across this page. It was only just before last Christmas that, having eaten kippers together at 1 o'clock on the morning at the Hambone Club, London's only really bohemian club, of which I am about to tell you, I strolled with him as far as Germain Street, and we stood outside the house where he had rooms.
"My dear Lecure," he said, "au revoir to you. You are going skiing in Switzerland, and I go to the Riviera. We shall both be back in town in March, and then we will pick another pair of those succulent kippers, which are such a specialty as the ham bun. Eh? We grasped hands and parted, while I walked along to the Devonshire in the moonlight. He went out to Queux, and alas died there a few weeks later. And as I write this, his cheery caricature, drawn by Sava Botstrarich, still laughs out to me from its silver frame. I referred to Arthur Lambton as the energetic organizer and secretary of the Crimes Club. He tells a good story about a murder. It will be recollected that Devereux murdered his wife, put her body in a trunk, and then poured glue all over her. When the trunk was opened, she was taken out stiff and viscous like a fish. Being at breakfast with his father, the late General Arthur Lambton, my friend asked, "Anything in the paper this morning?" "No," replied the General, "except that I see a gentleman named Devereux has put his wife in aspic." I have mentioned the Hambone Club. It is but vaguely known to society, and then only through the press publishing an occasional paragraph concerning it. Few even of artistic and literary London are aware of its existence. As befits the only real bohemian set still left in London, it keeps almost exclusively to itself. Yet it is surprising how many interesting and notable men, whose names are household words, gather together in stables and haylofts that have been transformed into the club premises. There artists, sculptors, editors, and other men of note go to enjoy themselves, to eat a cheap dinner, to laugh, to dance, to sup off kippers, and to find delight in innocent but exciting ragging. The walls of its big narrow room are covered with framed caricatures of the better-known members. There is a bar at one end with a big barrel on the counter and little tables set around, together with a piano that is played by a young Armenian pianist and composer of great promise, whom everyone calls Marcantonio. The place is crowded with members dancing with artists' models, mannequins from West End dressmakers, and other pretty girls who are only allowed to join the club after the committee has made the most searching inquiries and has proved that they were all regularly employed in some profession or other. The Hambone is the gayest, yet most wholesomely minded of all the London nightclubs. We go to the Embassy, where it is expensive, the 40-something, Rector's, and a dozen other night dance clubs. But the Hambone reigns supreme for fun, frolic, and a real good time. The Bohemians of London run it. I have attended other eccentric London clubs. There was the now long-defunct 13 Club, established to counteract the superstition attached to that supposed unlucky number. I knew the Magic Circle or Professional Conjurers Club, and am still a member of the Tattlers. Recently I was a guest with Lord Birkenhead and Arthur Lambton at a new club formed by Oxford undergraduates, on similar lines to our Crimes Club. Their name is the Thugs. I had a long discussion with the ex-Lord Chancellor as to whether the right pronunciation was Tugs, Thugs, or Thugs. He pronounced that it should be Tugs, so Tugs it is. That night, indeed, he was made a Tug, and seemed to thoroughly enjoy it. The club is one that we shall hear more of in the near future. Another club, of which I was once a member, may claim to be one of the most exclusive clubs in the world, the Florence Club, in Florence. The members, which consist for the most part of the proud but penurious Tuscan aristocracy, actually blackballed a British prince. After that, Major Percy Chapman, British Consul General in Florence, Montgomery Carmichael, British Consul to Leghorn, and all the English members resigned en bloc, including myself. For some years, too, I was a member of the Travellers' Club in Paris, and later of the Turf Club in Cairo, and the International Sporting Club at Monte Carlo. But of all clubs, I prefer the Devonshire, with its good old-fashioned comfort and its fine traditions. A good medical story was told me recently by my friend Dr. Cyril Horsford, the well-known laryngologist and aurist of Harley Street. While acting as specialist at the hospital at Genoa during the war, he found that to many of those rendered dumb by shell shock, speech could be induced by touching the patient's throat in a certain way, and suddenly asking him a question. Late one evening, a man was brought in and put to bed. He was unable to utter a word, so Horsford asked him if he would like to speak again. The man smiled incredulously, whereupon Horsford told him he would restore his speech at 12 o'clock tomorrow.
The patient, however, wrote down that he would bet him all he possessed that he would not. In the morning, the specialist had many patients to see, and at last the man in question was shown in. Horsford recognised him, and acted as he had done in other cases, whereupon the man at once spoke. "Ah, you'll see," said the doctor. "I have won my bet." "Excuse me, sir, you haven't," replied the man. "You said 12 o'clock. It's 10 minutes past." The most disreputable-looking person who ever entered the portals of the Devonshire Club was old Lord Clanricarde. I often chatted with him. He was shabby and parsimonious to the extreme. He had a mania for collecting paper bags. He used very often to stay at the Victoria Hotel at St. Leonard's, and I frequently met him out on the promenade doing his shopping. This consisted of buying a couple of bananas, or an apple, or perhaps a bun, which he would eat in a shelter, and then carefully preserve the bag until he had a pile upon his dressing-room, when his man upon his departure would carefully tie them up and take them away. He left, as is well known, his great fortune to the Lascelles family. Even London police court magistrates may be taken in. An acquaintance of mine, a well-known metropolitan stipendiary, met a few weeks ago an actor in another club of which I am a member. They became friendly, and eventually the magistrate lent him £100 on the wife-and-starving family appeal. The actor did not pay. The magistrate could not afford to risk publicity by putting him to the county court, so he rather foolishly wrote to the committee of the club asking them to remove the name of the delinquent from the list. The actor is now £100 the richer, and his worship will, I fear, have to whistle for his money. There are several variations of the following Devonshire Club story, but I give the true one, for which Everleigh Nash vouches. My friend Frank Richardson, as everyone knows, held whiskers in deadly horror. One day Max Beerbohm had arranged with Frank to lunch with him at the club. Max arrived a few minutes before 1 o'clock and went into the smoking room, where sat Thomas Barrett, head of the Pears soap firm, one of the best of men, who possessed a colossal white spade-shaped beard that swept halfway to his waist. Beerbohm did not know who Barrett was, but he saw at a glance his patriarchal beard, so he went out into the hall and pretended to be thoroughly overwhelmed. At that moment Richardson entered and dashed up to him. "What's the matter, Max?" he asked anxiously. "Hold my hand. Hold my hand," replied Beerbohm, with simulated breathlessness. "I've just seen Gord." In another of Frank Richardson's jokes, I myself participated. He had just written his book on whiskers and was having a deadly feud with Tacho Sims, as he called him. A few days before Christmas, when I entered the club, the porter handed me a large square parcel. I cut the string to find what appeared to be a handsome jewel box, which, on opening, I found to contain 3 bottles of a much-advertised toothwash, lying on a bed of apricot velvet. Inside was a letter from an enterprising firm asking me to accept the little present, and if I obtained any benefit from their preparation, would I kindly send them a line or two, which they might use when advertising. It was not an unusual request. I have had many such. "Hello, William," I heard Richardson exclaim behind me. "Then you've got a box too. I had mine a week ago." "Oh," I said, "what did you write to the people?" He took from his wallet a copy of his letter, the firm's reply, and his reply. Richardson wrote, "Sirs, I am very grateful to you for sending me your wonderful preparation. I have used it on my hair with marked effect. It is turning my hair quite grey. Yours very truly, Frank Richardson." To this the firm replied, regretting that Mr. Richardson had not read the directions, and that the preparation was intended for the teeth and not the hair. Frank's reply was, "Sirs, I have your letter, and I have thoroughly tested your preparation. I am glad to tell you that I have found it equally efficacious in dysentery and backache, in bleaching the hair and in putting a shine on my brown boots. Yours truly, Frank Richardson." Mr. Lewis Edmonds, K.C., who interests himself very much in the Devonshire Club, tells me some quaint stories of the bar. One he told at the fireside in the smoking room the other day was distinctly humorous. Once I was junior with Sir Frank Lockwood in a divorce case heard in camera before Mr. Justice Butt. Oh, a dreadful case, he said. Well, you know that the legal maxim is that a client must come into court with clean hands. During the course of the case, Lockwood, who was a marvellous caricaturist, drew a picture of our client with his hands dripping with ink. When the case was over, the parties went away in 2 cabs, which raced down the Strand and collided. Thereupon the parties got out and came to fisticuffs, the end being that they came up at Marlborough Street on cross summonses for assault. Rupert Grayson, who was a director of Everleigh Nash's publishing company, told me at the Guards Club, where I was dining with him one night, a very interesting story of Monte Carlo. Many stories of luck and fortune at Monte Carlo have been told, but this one that Grayson tells is even better, in my opinion, than most. An Englishman, punting at roulette, placed 5 francs en plein on number 17. The number turned up. He understood very little French, and when the croupier inquired whether he wished to leave his winnings on the number, he called across the table, 2, 2, meaning leave 2 and return the rest. The croupier, misunderstanding him, imagined it 2, 2, and began piling up the winnings on 17. When the Englishman saw that he was replacing more than 2 plaques, he shouted excitedly, 2, enough, enough. The croupier, thinking he said 2, 9, 9, transferred the whole of his winnings to number 9. 9 rouge, impair et manque, replied the croupier a moment later. The Englishman had won over 6,000 francs with his original 5 francs and 2 coups. Talking of Monte Carlo, Louis Drexel, Rupert Grayson's brother-in-law, tells a good story of his father, Tony Drexel, who was staying at the Hôtel de Paris. At 3 o'clock every morning, his father was awakened by a man in the room above throwing his boots violently onto the floor. This practice became so unbearable that at last complaints were addressed to Fleury, who was then manager at the Paris. The Frenchman apologized. Monsieur Fleury could rest assured that it would not happen again. Next morning, punctually at 3 o'clock, the Frenchman returned to his room. Unthinkingly, following his usual custom, he hurled his right boot to the floor before he remembered with horror his promise. In the room below, Tony Drexel, awakened as usual, lay waiting for the second boot. Long dreary hours passed, till a message reached the Frenchman. As Mr. Drexel would like to get to sleep, would the gentleman have the goodness to throw down the second boot as soon as possible? The late Sir George Lewis, the famous solicitor, once declared to me in the Devonshire, "The divorce court is the biggest blackmailing court in all Europe. In half the cases there is blackmailing, and a general square-up all round before the parties go into court. The public never sees divorce proceedings in their true light. The lawyers know, but the public is unaware." The next day he used the same words in giving evidence before the Divorce Commission. This view is borne up by my friend Lord Birkenhead, who quite recently declared to me that he had long reached the conclusion that our divorce laws are almost the worst in the civilized world. Discussing the question with the Divorce Law Reform Union, at which the brilliant ex-Lord Chancellor is president, he told them that "there is no chicanery and no trickery to which judges in the divorce court have not been compelled to resort. This does not apply to judges in any other court of law. There is no room in this country for a clergy established by law who deny the right of marriage to people freed by law and a church established by law," he asserted. Another fellow clubman at the Devonshire is a tall, cheery, athletic golf player, well known in business circles in London, Mr. A. Noel Mobbs, brother of the famous Colonel E. R. Mobbs, TSO, who was 10 years ago popular as wing three-quarter in the English rugby football team. When Colonel Mobbs died, a subscription fund for a memorial reached £2,600, and a bust was a year ago put up to his memory in the Market Square in Northampton, the balance being given to various charitable institutions in which he was interested. My claim to fame as being Edgar's brother, Noel Mobbs is fond of saying. But Noel Mobbs has another distinction, that of finance. For after the war, he and a few friends gave the British government £7.5 million sterling for the dump at Slough. In addition, he is chairman of half a dozen other big companies, to which he attends with his merry laughter in his intervals between golf and bridge. I was with him skiing in Murin last year, and I witnessed one of the funniest sights I ever saw on the snow. Mobbs, tall, thin and athletic in proper ski garb, had picked up the art of skiing in a marvellous manner, and started to run down the Ulmenthubel slope, which is very steep, as any ski runner knows. As he approached the raised snowbank at the bottom, he saw a pretty young lady in sweater and cap seated on the bank, admiring the view across to the Jungfrau. He made an attempt to telemark, and thus stopped dead, but he bungled it at about 25 miles an hour, crossed his skis, ran them home in the snow, and landed plump in the astonished girl's lap. There he remained in an undignified position, and with many apologies for a full 10 minutes before he could be extricated, his skis being so deeply embedded. Many stories are told in clubs and elsewhere of men who by surreptitious means obtain a larger share of spirits than others not so cute. Colonel F.J. Agabeg of the Chota Nagpur Regiment, who was so well known in India before he retired and came to live in Bedfordshire, told me in Murin last winter a very good example of this. A brother officer of his one day after polo was seated on Agabeg's veranda and was about to take a peg. The native servant was pouring out the whisky into a big thirst-quenching glass and asked, "How much, Sahib?" "Oh, just cover the ice," was the careless reply. The Indian servant poured on, being unaware that ice floats. In telling these stories, I hope I have not taken the reader too frequently under the spreading chestnut tree. But if I have recounted an anecdote he knows, well, I ask him to forgive me, particularly if I have told it in an inferior way. Perhaps I may print some further reminiscences one day. For the present, these must suffice. End of chapter 19. End of Things I Know About Kings, Celebrities and Crooks by William Le Queux.